before we get started with some housekeeping measures and all that, first I'd like to ask Reverend Terry Hamilton Poore to come up and start us off with an invocation from First Presbyterian Church, Birmingham.
Good morning. Will you pray with me? God of all, we know that every part of this earth is sacred, and whatever befalls the earth befalls us. We thank you for those whose vision and planning and generosity have created this gathering, for the expertise of our speakers and the combined wisdom of the participants, and for the willingness of all who are here to share their time in learning and collaboration as we seek to do our part in safeguarding this planet and all of its creatures. As we gather today, we ask that you would strengthen our connectedness and inspire our creativity. Help us to listen carefully and to speak respectfully, moving through any perceived impasses to forge a common path that we can all follow toward a healthy and sustainable future, for we will all either perish or flourish together. Amen.
I want to share with you a little bit about the origin of this conference. People have asked me why Faith Meets Business. Well, frankly, it was just an outright piece of marketing. We believe that the faith community and the business community hold the key to climate solutions. If we can get all of us together, those people of faith and people who drive the economy, we can get to the point where we make the changes necessary to save a livable climate for our kids and our grandkids. So we never held the attendance here to just people of faith, just people of business. A lot of us here have a variety of different beliefs and a variety of different involvements. But all together, it's going to take all of us making some changes. So, I'd like to introduce our co-chair, Dr. Joyce Lanning, who is going to give us a little bit of guidance in the expectations for our behavior and our productivity today.
I haven't used that doctor thing since I've been out of the classroom, but I look around and say, Doctor who? But anyway, I am so overwhelmed by the incredible number of you who've chosen to give your Saturday this way. I ask you to do this. If there is a place that you savor, that you would like to save, if you could keep it in your mind or even write it on one of your cards and keep it in your mind today. Because E.B. White is supposed to have said, I wake up in the morning and I can't decide whether to savor the world or save it, and it makes it hard to plan the day. So we have our day planned, and think about that as you go on. The other thing that I like to think about is that we really are looking for adventurous civility. This is a place where we can bridge the gaps where we don't usually talk to each other about things that matter to us, and all points of view are welcome here. In fact, I would say this. Look at this wonderful group of people. Whoever you are and wherever you live and whatever you favor as climate solutions, this is a place for you. You are welcome here, and I am overwhelmed at your presence, and I thank you for it. I guess the other thing is about how to listen with great respect. Just this morning, my husband asked me to please not complete his sentences for him. So I'm a recovering interrupter. So we will all try to give our full attention to whoever is speaking and not try to be formulating our own points of view. I was trained to give the Inconvenient Truth talk back in 2007. I went to Antarctica with Jim McClintock in 2007. This has been my focus for those 13 or so years. And I guess I would like to say this. The question is, must we change? What do you think the answer is? Yes. The another question is, can we change? All right, here's the hard one. Will we change? Yes. Okay, let's hear it. Let's hear the yeses. Yes. Well, I left my notes back at the desk, so I'm not sure what else I was supposed to say, but it is a pleasure to have you here. You are the wisdom in the room. We're making stone soup, if you know that story, which means that people bring their differing ingredients and we create something that none of us could have done alone. So now, my pleasure. This space is a wonderful place to have a meeting, and the team here at McWane Science Center has been extraordinary, and it starts with leadership. I'm not going to introduce Amy because I hope you're in the, maybe you're not in the bio, I don't know. But Amy, we are very, very pleased to have her here in Birmingham. And she will welcome us for this wonderful gift of space and then introduce Jim McClintock. Amy?
Thank you. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to McWane Science Center this morning. Our mission here at McWane is to spark wonder and curiosity about our world through hands-on science experiences. And implicit in that mission is that we must preserve and protect the world in which we live. And so I'm delighted that you are all here today to talk about that very thing. In our strategic plan at McWane, it calls for us to be the venue for important conversations that happen about science that affect our community and our world. Whether we are the initiators of those programs, whether we put those programs on ourselves, or whether other organizations choose to come here as the venue for those conversations, we want McWane to be the place where people gather to talk about the scientific issues that really matter in our community and throughout our world. So I'm especially happy that you're here today to talk about climate and the effect of climate change on our community. So now it is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Jim McClintock. His incredibly impressive bio is there in the program, so I'm not going to read it to you. But I am very pleased to say that Jim has been a long time partner and supporter of McWane Science Center. He's a former board member, and almost all of the programs and activities and exhibits that we have ever done that relate to climate change, Jim has either been a partner or a consultant in all of those. A few years ago, I felt strongly that all of our staff needed to understand this important issue. Not just the educators who are the ones that whose job it is to talk to our visitors about issues, but everybody who works at McWane needed to understand that issue and needed to be able to interact with our visitors when they had questions or when we had pushback, to be able to understand what we were talking about. And so I was thrilled. I invited Jim to come and talk to our staff. It was the highest turnout we have ever had for any kind of staff continuing education program, and that was a few years ago, and they're still talking about it. And so we've done that. More recently, we were delighted to be the venue for a program that Jim and his colleagues put on that was designed, it was a workshop designed to help teachers understand how do you talk about climate change in the classroom? How do you make that issue come alive in the classroom? It was a phenomenal program, and we were thrilled to be the venue there. Jim has been featured in a variety of some of the most important media outlets in America, including National Geographic, the Smithsonian, Discover, Scientific American, CNN, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, the Weather Channel, the list goes on. And we are incredibly fortunate that he lives and works right here in Birmingham. And so without further ado, let me introduce my friend Jim McClintock.
Thank you, Amy. It's an honor to be here. What a fantastic turnout. Okay. All right. Well, what I want to do is to introduce you to the topic of climate change, and I'm going to do that by first taking you to Antarctica, where I've spent the last 30 years working. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how climate change in Antarctica isn't just about Antarctica. It actually is connected to us here in Alabama. I'll never forget the first time I put a dry suit on, dropped into water that was minus 1.8 degrees centigrade, went through 6 feet of ice and looked down on a seafloor covered with sponges and corals as far as I could see. I had no idea that this was one of the richest marine ecosystems on our planet. Well, I have worked on the marine biology of that system for many, many years. And the last 20 have been spent at Palmer Station, one of 3 American stations, this one on the Antarctic Peninsula. I had no idea when I moved there 20 years ago that I was moving to one of the fastest changing places on our planet. In fact, if you go back and look at the maps of warming, like this from National Geographic, you can see that the focus was primarily on the Arctic. Lots of attention on the Arctic. But that little orange area on the bottom of our planet was covering the peninsula where I was headed. And now we know from more scientific analysis that actually the western portion of the continent and the peninsula are warming. This is not just the peninsula. So you can find that there's some warming going on the east side as well. Those little red dots that surround Antarctica are places where the ice shelves are melting. This is because the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the largest current on our planet, is warming now. And those ice shelves, about 1,000-foot thick ice, are beginning to melt. So it's not just on the west side of Antarctica, but now we know the whole continent is being impacted to some degree. So I've been working here at Palmer Station, where that arrow is, and we know from a nearby station that's been taking air temperatures for 60 years that the midwinter air temperatures in my area around Palmer have warmed about 10 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 60 years. That is remarkable. What does that mean? It means that when I arrived at Palmer Station 20 years ago, the Mar Glacier behind the station would calve. A big piece would drop into the bay about once a week. When I was at Palmer about 1.5 years ago, this was happening 2 or 3 times a day. The 87% of the glaciers along the western Antarctic Peninsula are receding. We know this also from measuring the recession of the glacier, like this technician that hikes the leading edge of the glacier carrying a GPS unit and talking to a satellite. And we add another line to our map showing where the glacier is now and where it was back in the 1960s. That little picture of Chuck and Maggie Amsler, who are down at Palmer Station as I speak, my colleagues, when they arrived in the 70s, you could open the back door of the station and almost step onto the glacier, and now you hike 1/2 kilometer to get to it. You can see where the glacier was in 1975 compared to 2013 in this aerial photograph. And we now have instruments that can measure glacial thinning from space. Can you imagine the ability to measure at an accuracy of 1/2 inch the thinning of glacial ice? And you can see in the red areas on the western side of Antarctica, the peninsula, and look at Greenland from the northern hemisphere. Glacial thinning is happening. Now, you may have heard about this in the news this past week or two. The Thwaites Glacier, and effectively a cork that is a glacier positioned on the western side of the continent, about the size of Florida, is receding at a remarkable rate. It is essentially the place that the western ice sheet empties into the ocean. The ice sheets of Antarctica, those 2-mile thick ice sheets, move on the west to the west, on the east to the east. This is where they move from the west, is through that funnel where the Thwaites Glacier is. They stuck a thermal probe down 1,000 feet, expecting to find water that was minus 1.8 degrees. It was 2 degrees warmer. This is a big deal because it means that the underside of these ice shelves and this glacier are melting faster than we thought. That influences sea level rise. What about ice sheets that I mentioned earlier, these 1,000-foot thick sheets? Well, let me take you to a couple of them real quick and show you what's happening. Here on the eastern side, the Larsen B ice shelf in January of 2002 showed striations and then began to actually disintegrate within a month. 2 weeks later, a satellite caught the entire disintegration of the Larsen B ice shelf. This is a piece of real estate the size of Rhode Island that just floated away. In the news 2 summers ago, the Larsen C, big crack in it. They followed the crack until it literally floated out to sea, a chunk of ice the size of Delaware, one of the largest icebergs we've ever recorded on Earth. The good news about the ice sheet breakouts, they're already in the water. The ice sheets are in the water. What does that mean? It means when they melt, they do not contribute to sea level rise. It's the same physics as a glass of ice water. So that's good. The concern among scientists, though, is that the ice sheets are barriers to the movement of ice off the continent and into the ocean, which does contribute to sea level rise. You remove the barrier, the rate of ice flow goes up 3 or 4 times. So that is a concern about the ice sheet loss. What's happening to life? What's happening to the marine life of this area that I've been working in? When I arrived at Palmer 20 years ago, Bill Frazier in this photograph, when he was a grad student, had labeled or tagged 16,000 breeding pairs of Adelie penguins as a graduate student. That's a dissertation. He's come back every year for 45 years and followed the Adelie penguins on the islands in front of our station. And Bill's not finding a good story. If you look at his data, that purple line, you can see where he labeled the 16,000 breeding pairs in 1974. And he told me in an email just a month ago that this year the count's going to be about 1,100. We're looking at about a 90% decrease in the Adelie penguin in this region of Antarctica. Surprisingly, 2 other penguins have shown up, the Gentoo and the chinstrap. Smaller numbers, but they're moving in. They're moving in, they're establishing colonies. They're coming from warmer places. They're moving down the peninsula as it warms. They're extending their ranges. This is something that we're seeing with climate change. Now, what's happening to Bill's Adelies? Unfortunately, as it's warming, it's getting more humid, it's snowing more, it's snowing later than it used to. So the Adelies come in, they're genetically programmed to lay their eggs at a particular time. They do so, along comes an unseasonably late snowstorm, buries the colony, and sadly, when the ice melts, the snow melts, the eggs can't get air, they drown. You lose an entire generation of Adelies. The other challenge is the sea ice. Adelies love sea ice. They're dependent upon the sea ice. They use it as a platform to skid across on their bellies, to get out to the ice edge where they feed on krill, the basis of the food webs of Antarctica, the little shrimp that are so important. Well, with the sea ice gone, the Adelies now have to swim offshore to get to their food. And that takes a lot more energy than they used to have to spend. And Bill thinks that's tough on them to raise their chicks. So that's conspiring for the success of the Adelie. Krill themselves live under the sea ice, and they too could suffer as the sea ice disappears. And this would have an impact on baleen whales that feed on krill. Now today, the news is pretty good about whales. They're recovering very well from the whaling days. But we worry down the road with krill being reduced. Are they going to have impacts? Is this going to impact the ability of whales and seals and penguins and fish that are feeding on krill? Any of the marine life affiliated with the sea ice could be impacted, like the Weddell seal, this beautiful seal that has ice chipping teeth. And when the female's pregnant, she swims up under the sea ice, finds a weak spot, chips away at it until she has a hole big enough to pull herself up through the hole and lay there and give birth. Her pups completely free of predators. The killer whales, the leopard seals out at the ice edge can't get to her, all because of her dentition and her ability to use that sea ice as a refuge. I don't think they'll disappear like the Adelies do, but we don't know. They may have to follow the ice. The leopard seal, the 10-foot long, 1,000-pound animal that when we see when we're diving sends chills up and down our backs. We actually drop a siren into the water to alert the divers to come together back to back and come up out of the water when they get a chance. We don't want to take a chance on the leopard seal. Being scientists, we do not want to test the hypothesis that leopard seals may take a human. We don't want to go there. Nobody has ever seen one of these beautiful seals give birth anywhere but on sea ice. So we don't know what's going to happen when the sea ice disappears. Will the leopard seals go to land for the first time and give birth, or will they have to follow the retreat of the ice? What's going to happen to the forests of seaweeds that live under the water on the Antarctic Peninsula as it warms? Probably they're going to do fairly well because the sea ice will disappear. They'll have more light, so they may grow deeper. They may move down the coast a ways. But we also know that these forests from our own research produce chemicals that defend them from predators. And with more sunlight, they may have more energy to produce more chemicals or different chemicals. So the ecosystem could change very dramatically as this happens. What about the offspring of sponges and soft corals and starfish and sea urchins, things like this little larva you're looking at that's going to turn into a sea star? If you bring these larvae into the laboratory in Antarctica and you warm up the temperature about 2 degrees, instead of developing in 4 months, they develop in 4 weeks. They're very temperature sensitive. So that might be good. It might mean the larvae are in the water for a shorter time, but it also could be a problem. These larvae feed on phytoplankton. What if they show up at the phytoplankton, or they show up to feed on a phytoplankton bloom and it's already happened, or it hasn't happened yet? In other words, they show up at the cafeteria and the door's locked. So you could have an offsetting of the predator and the prey. Now, I already mentioned some organisms that are showing up as it warms. Remember? Gentoos, chinstrap penguins? Well, guess what? Elephant seals have arrived. On a warm afternoon in the middle of the station, do you know what 10 big elephant seals smell like? It is rough. So they are moving down as it warms. The Antarctic fur seal in the bottom right, we are now seeing fur seals moving into the area from the north where they're moving down as it's warming. They haven't established a colony yet like the elephant seals, but they probably will. Probably the most poignant range extension, or I might even use the word invasion, I can tell you about. I'll set the stage with this slide. Now, the seafloor of Antarctica is ancient because Antarctica separated from South America about 40 million years ago. And when it did and moved south, the Antarctic circumpolar current essentially locked Antarctica into a deep freeze. And those animals that could adapt did, and those that couldn't perished. And there's some very conspicuous things that are not in Antarctic waters. There are no sharks in Antarctic waters. There are no fish with crushing jaws. All 250 species of Antarctic fish are wimps. They have weak little jaws. They feed on little crustaceans. There is nothing with a claw. There are no crabs. There are no lobsters. So the animals that have evolved in this seafloor community have never dealt with a crushing predator. So if I was to hand Maggie Johnston an Antarctic clam, she could take it with 2 fingers and crush the shells. They're very weakly calcified. This sets them at risk. If there was a crushing predator, such as what was discovered in 2007 for the first time moving up the Antarctic slope, 13 king crabs, and that could potentially move onto the shelf, that could rewrite the ecology of this system. And in fact, over 1.5 million king crabs were discovered in a deep canyon off of the station. In the meantime, I had written a proposal to NSF with a colleague, and we got it funded, and we went down to Antarctica 3 times, and we took this ship, and we leased a submarine from Woods Hole, and we pulled the submarine up the slope, taking pictures every 15 seconds of the slope of Antarctica up to the shelf, trying to decide or figure out, are the king crabs there? Have they reached the shelf? Are they on the slope? How abundant are they? What are they eating? How are they impacting things? And guess what? We took millions, well, hundreds of thousands, well, maybe tens of thousands. We took a lot of pictures. When you have that kind of database, you use something very important in science called the graduate student. And so we had them analyze all those images, and we found that the king crabs are there in the millions on the slope, but they have not reached the shelf yet. So that's good news that they haven't. And then ocean acidification, the poor stepchild to climate warming, we don't hear enough about. This is where 30% of the carbon dioxide that we produce and add to the atmosphere ends up in the world's oceans. And since the Industrial Revolution, the oceans have become about 30% more acidic. So this is a problem. It's a bigger problem in Antarctica where the water's colder and more CO2 is absorbed. It's a simple physics relationship. And the animals there are weakly calcified. So we've looked at ocean acidification in Antarctica. We're doing that as I speak in experiments at Palmer Station. I'll just mention that you can go to the Southern Ocean today, not a year from now, not 100 years from now, and you can collect a little sea butterfly. They're about the size of the tip of a pencil. They have an aragonitic shell. It's just beautiful. They're so common that they're like the stars in our sky. And you can take one, put it under a microscope, and you can see the etching on the shell from the dissolving already from ocean acidification. So this is something that's already happening in certain regions of our oceans. And some of the amphipods, these little crustaceans that we work with, have shown that they're very sensitive to ocean acidification. Now, I would not be happy if it affected my friend here, because I discovered that this amphipod in Antarctica captures and carries on its back a sea butterfly, a little snail that has no shell and wings, and we found hundreds of these little shrimp-like amphipods, each carrying a live sea butterfly. Why would you go to all the trouble? Well, it turns out that the sea butterfly tastes terrible to fish. There's a chemical in it. If you take the sea butterfly off the back of the little amphipod, the fish will eat it every time. If you leave the sea butterfly on the back, they'll take it in their mouth and then poof, spit it right back at you. How's that? One species abducting another for its own defense. The only kind in the world that does this. It shows what discoveries remain in Antarctica. So these are all the things that I've just mentioned very quickly. A tremendous amount of change in the ice features, the glaciers, the ice sheets, the animals that are affiliated with the sea ice, organisms moving into regions that they hadn't been seen before, ocean acidification, king crabs. We're going from a community that has looked like this for millennia, where you have the sea ice very dependably showing up every year. You have the Adelie penguin, lots of krill, a dense forest and a seafloor community, all powered by the ACC, this nutrient-rich water from the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. And I believe by mid-century, certainly no later than end of century, the sea ice will be gone, the Adelie will be gone, the Gentoo and the chinstrap will have moved in, the forests will have expanded, we might have crabs, king crabs in the system. It's a fundamental change. It's not a minor change. And of course, ecosystems change. We know that. They always change. But what's so fundamentally different right now is the rate of change. When people ask you about climate change, it's not that things don't change. Of course they do. It's the rate of change. And this is why biologists are so concerned about how life is going to be able to respond to such rapid changes. So why should we care? Antarctica is a long way from the McWane Center. It'd take you over a week to get down there from here if you left right now. So I like to share some of the work that we've been doing at UAB over the years as an example of a very tangible product of what we've been doing down in Antarctica. And that is when we do our chemical studies of these organisms, we don't just look at their ecology, we look to see if they have chemicals that could be developed into drugs to fight disease. We found a chemical in an Antarctic tunicate that has activity against melanoma skin cancer. And we now have the genes that produce that from this tunicate, and we might be able to put them in bacteria and make a new drug to fight melanoma skin cancer. We found a compound in an Antarctic sponge that's active against MRSA, this bacterial infection that you get in the hospital. And this was the first one active against MRSA that's under a biofilm. So my point is, this is the tip of the iceberg, excuse the pun, of potential resources in a very ancient ecosystem related to drug discovery. Why would we squander that to climate change? Now, I do a lot of lecturing on climate change around the country. You know, I used to get asked, is climate really warming? Is the Earth really warming? I'm not sure about that. I have not been asked that question probably in 5 years. And so I want you to go online and Google, climate change, global warming, whatever you want. There's lots of data there. But this is the data that convinced me, the final straw. I absolutely have there is no way that anybody can question. In fact, in science, we call these hard data. So, in all seriousness, what I get asked now is, okay, the Earth is warming a little bit, but do we have any role in that? Do humans have a role? And I want to show you what convinced me as a scientist that we do, and how perfect is it that it's from Antarctica. So you're looking at an ice core here, okay? You're looking at an ice core. It's about the diameter of a grapefruit. It goes down through the ice sheet on the top of Antarctica, 3,600 meters. The bottom of the ice core is to your left, the top to your right. It's laying on its side. And as you go down through the ice, you're going back in time. In fact, you're going back about 420,000 years in this image. And the really cool thing about ice cores is that you can pull little air bubbles out of the ice core and analyze what the chemistry of the atmosphere was at that time. How much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere 420,000 years ago? That's the red line that you're looking at that goes up and down. And then the blue line is temperature, and you can calculate that indirectly from oxygen isotopes. So look what happens to the red line. That's the carbon dioxide that we worry about. That's the greenhouse gas. That red line never goes above 300 parts per million in the last 420,000 years. I drew a big black line across there to make that point. Look what happens to the carbon dioxide levels when we get to the Industrial Revolution. That red line just skyrockets. In fact, this is dated now. I think we're up to about 411 parts per million now. And that's more than a 25% increase in a very well-established greenhouse warming gas since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. I can't tell you if that means that we're 90% responsible for the warming, or 80 or 75, but I believe it's very significant. I really do believe there's a human fingerprint on what's happening with warming. And you were curious about why that red line goes up and down in those 100,000-year cycles. That's called the Milankovitch cycle, and it has to do with the 100,000-year elliptical orbit of the Earth around the sun that drives that pattern. So, Antarctica, Alabama, worlds apart, aren't they? But are they? In fact, if you realize that the currents in Antarctica are perhaps some of the most pervasive currents on the planet in terms of driving climate, you realize that because the largest current that goes around the Antarctic continent, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, actually feeds up into both the Atlantic and Pacific in the northern hemisphere. This current pattern essentially drives atmospheric pressure, humidity, air temperatures, wind patterns. In other words, Antarctica is a climate maker, even in the northern hemisphere. So some of the things that we're experiencing here could be related to things that are happening there. Now, you may have noticed recently that we're having hotter days in Alabama. I certainly have. I'm talking about days in the upper 90s where we have heat indexes that are well into the hundreds. I'm talking about football games where they kicked off at 2:30 in the afternoon down in Tuscaloosa, and they didn't have enough. The 100 medics that showed up weren't enough to take care of heat stroke. These numbers of extreme hot days, as we know from healthcare individuals like Paul Irwin, who's here with us today, the dean at UAB of Public Health, are a problem for human health. These increased numbers of incidents. We're having hurricanes that are more powerful in our state or below our state. I don't know how many of you realize that Hurricane Michael was elevated to a 5 after being thought initially to be a 4. We had several 5s come across the Atlantic recently. It's not that we have more hurricanes under a climate change scenario. It's just that when they move across warm water, they get more powerful. And so they're hitting the shore with more rigor. And I drove through this area after the hurricane, and it was really devastated in Mexico Beach. The Antarctic ice sheets, of course, are contributing to sea level rise, as is the Greenland ice sheet. And we know that in Alabama since 1960, we've had on the order of 4 to 6 inches of sea level rise along our coast. What does this mean? Well, if you live in Miami, you know all too well that you can have sea level rise impacting you today. You can have high tide flooding in the streets of Miami with the sun out. And of course, if you go down to Dauphin Island and drive down to the West End, you can find impacts of not only the movement of sand on this island to the West End, but also the impacts of sea level rise. We're getting more intensive rainfall. Did you notice that? It's absolutely amazing. The Cahaba River, my beloved Cahaba River, is chocolate for days, and they're suffering more and more scour from the effects of these very, very torrential rains. So we may not have more rains, but when we do have rain, it comes down harder and more harder than it used to, and this causes all sorts of issues that are different for us. So I'd like to say that this is sort of a gloomy picture, but let me give you a model for hope, because I think that's important, and one that I really believe in, and one that's in Antarctica. How perfect, right? In 1985, there were two technicians that were sitting at their desk, and they looked at the data and they said, you know, our boss in England is not going to believe this. And they sent the data to their boss in England, and he did not believe it. He sent them back to Antarctica the next day with a spectrophotometer, a new one, and told them to take the measurements again. And guess what? They found the same thing. They could not believe it. And they published perhaps one of the most important scientific studies of the 20th century in Nature, describing a massive hole in the ozone over the entire continent of Antarctica, a hole that was so big it drifted periodically over New Zealand. And of course, this is a big deal. This is the layer that protects us from ultraviolet radiation. And it also affected weather and climate in Antarctica, the ozone hole. So it had a global effect on climate. But you know what's amazing is that within 2 years of that paper coming out in Nature, 20 countries sat down around a table in Montreal, Canada, and ratified the Montreal Protocol that regulated the chlorofluorocarbons, the refrigerants, that were destroying our ozone. And today, there are 197 signatories to the Montreal Protocol. And even better, it's worked. In fact, Susan Solomon, the scientist who discovered the basis for that destruction of the ozone, who works at MIT, told me that now the projections are that the hole may close mid-century instead of end of century. How fantastic. It's a bigger step to think about carbon dioxide, but it can be done. All right, well, just let me finish up by talking a little bit about my outreach. And as a scientist, what I'm trying to do in sharing this narrative with the general public. The first thing I was told is if you're going to get out of your science lab, you've got to write a book. You've got to write a book for the general public about this. And I looked into writing a book, and I was quickly told, you have to have a literary agent. And then I was told that to get a literary agent, you had to have a book. And I thought, well, this is a conundrum. So I turned to my colleague, E.O. Wilson, perhaps one of the most famous scientists alive today, who was born here in Birmingham, raised in Mobile. And he was very kind to help me get a literary agent. And when my book came out, his director of his foundation called me and said, Jim, we love the chapter on the Adelie penguin. We want to use that as a wonderful sort of story to share in the aquariums and zoos of America about how climate change is affecting the Adelie. And we're going to do this little video. And I thought she was asking me if I would narrate it. And she said, no, we'll have Harrison do it. And I said, Harrison who? And she said, of course, Harrison Ford, he's on the board with you. And I thought, well, great. So you can go to YouTube and you can watch or you can listen to Harrison Ford narrating from my chapter. And this is another very good venue, of course, is video and film to talk about climate change. And what about this guy? I met him at Palmer Station. I was asked to tour. I was told by the station manager that somebody important was coming the next day. Would I lead the tour? I said, who is it? He said, I can't tell you. I said, why? He said, security. I said, but we're in Antarctica. So anyway, Bill Gates showed up the next day with his father, Bill Jr., Bill Sr., and his stepmother and his son Rory. And I took him around, and Bill was so interested in the science and climate and what was happening in Antarctica. And after lunch, it was my job to take Bill and his father up to a room and show them the U.S. video on the National Science Foundation Antarctic program. So I went up there at lunch and put 2 big chairs in the front of the room, and they came in, and Bill Jr. and Bill Sr. were sitting there ready to go, and the IT guy came in and could not get Microsoft to boot up. That was my Microsoft moment. And actually, his father went, "You need to fix this." Another thing I've been doing for 15 years, and I just got back last week, is taking people to Antarctica. I know it has its pros and cons, tourism in Antarctica. I'm more on the con now because these people come back changed. They come back ambassadors to Antarctica. They talk to their congressmen, their senators. I really think it's important to get people down there to see the effects and realize how dramatic they are. I also was very fortunate to work with Mark Johnson to organize a workshop that's related to what we're talking about today on spirituality and climate that we held at Camp McDowell for several days. We had, I think, 5 different religions were represented. And it was wonderful. I talked about the science of climate change, and Mark talked about the care of creation in a biblical context. And I think it was very successful. And I think there's huge potential in this area. I've also been named the face of the Nature Conservancy's Can We Talk Climate campaign. We need to talk about climate more in this country. We're shy about climate change. So this is a pledge where you go online and you pledge absolutely not a penny. You just pledge to talk to somebody about climate change within a week. And then they have wonderful advice about how to talk to Uncle Charlie about global warming. It's just wonderful. And then I'm going to end on this note. I was very honored this past year to be invited up to New York to receive the Roan Finn Award for Antarctic Research that's given every 4 years by the Explorers Club. And there were 1,700 people who came to the dinner. But the honor for me was not so much the award, but the fact that on stage with me were 8 of the Apollo astronauts. And we actually had dinner with Mike Collins, who was the one who was up in the orbiter, and my wife, who loves everything space, was just going, she was in heaven. So the last part of the evening, they were asked to each give an anecdote about their experience in the moon, actually in the Apollo missions that they'd been involved in. And Mike Collins gave a wonderful note, and he's the one right there in the middle that's kind of looking down the aisle there to the left. Mike was in the orbiter, and Buzz Aldrin, who's up in the top right and down at the end there, he's one of the guys that went down to the moon with Neil Armstrong. Mike didn't particularly care for Buzz. A lot of people had trouble with Buzz. He was a little bit of a kind of a tough character. And apparently that when the moon vehicle came back off the surface of the moon and had to reconnect with the orbiter, they have to ask permission to reconnect. And Mike said, "No. I have a list." So he got his list of gripes about Buzz, and he made him agree to each of them before they were allowed to reconnect and come back to Earth. And I thought that was wonderful. But the moment of the evening was when the last astronaut to the right, Rusty Schweickart, the pilot of Apollo 9, stood up, very serious. Everybody became very quiet. And behind him was the beautiful image of the Earthrise. And he looked down the row of his colleagues and he said, "You know, all of us on the stage here have been in space. We've looked back at this planet. It is the most delicate planet you can imagine. The biosphere is just a thin little layer around it, and we really need to take care of this." And that was how the evening ended, and I thought that was so perfect. So I'm going to end right there. Thank you.
If you have any questions for Jim, we don't have time to answer them now, but please hand them in and we'll see what we can do about it later. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. Bambi, if you'll sit at the far end, I think you're going to be last. If these panelists weren't friends beforehand, they'll be pretty close afterward because they're shoulder to shoulder. John Northrup, if you'll sit this first one, and then Jack West, if you'll come and get the next seat, and then Seth Hammett, and then Jonathan Belcher. And we are thrilled to have all 5 of you. They're going to have to talk fast. But there are so many different perspectives that they offer here, and we're very fortunate to have them. So there will be a timekeeper on this experience. Our timekeeper is right there. She'll hold up a thing for 3 minutes, and she'll hold up a thing for 1 minute. They each have 8 minutes. Now, it's not personal, but when they hit their 8 minute, we'll ring the bell. Because I've been at meetings where downstream, all those speakers are squeezed, and you don't even get to hear from them because we've run out of time. So we're going to be very timely, and I really appreciate it. So you've met John Northrup. He is going to speak from the perspective of a price on carbon. These bios are in your program, and I'm not going to take their time reading them. But he's our vice president, and he's our group leader for Citizens Climate Lobby, Citizens Climate Education. Jack West is the vice president and counsel for InPower, which is a solar group. He's also a CCL member. Seth Hammett has served as years for our Speaker of the House state, but he's executive with the Power South, one of our energy producers, and he's also chairman of the Energy Institute of Alabama, which has 6 power producers in it. Buildings, we live in buildings. We spend a lot of our carbon in buildings, and Jonathan Belcher is Signature Homes president, and he's been instrumental. He built those homes out at Reynolds Landing for Alabama Power's experiment about smart homes. And Bambi Ingram is with UAB. She is the manager of sustainability there, and UAB has just gone through a very interesting sustainability planning process. They're a small city. The reason I put Bambi last, even so she's not, is because all of the issues end up in that arena. So without further, you start your time, and John?
I'm going to pass over this because Jim did a great job of explaining that. And I'm not going to spend much time on the consequences because I think he did a great job of explaining what's actually happening and what price we're in the process of paying for what's happening. I will talk a little bit about the economy because I think it's really important for folks to understand. This is from a Brookings Institution report a few months back. It's really interesting. The economic impacts of climate change throughout this century are going to be concentrated in this country right where we are. We won't go into details on that, but I want you to know that where you see the red and it looks pink on the map of Alabama, I couldn't make it red. This is where total county income, and this is county by county data, this is where county by county, Alabama, particularly its rural areas, will suffer among the worst anywhere in this country. And we face a mounting challenge. This is not a static situation. We have a greenhouse, what I call greenhouse momentum. There's already plenty of CO2 out there, and there's also more being produced all the time, so that it's going to take a while to back off to stop the process of warming. So we even if we applied the brakes today, we've still got to stop the car. Deforestation, obviously a big problem. Take away trees, you take away the carbon processing. Population and consumption growth, we haven't figured out yet that we have too many people on the planet already, and more of us are consuming more and more. Polar reflectivity, when you lose the ice caps, you lose the ability for the planet to shed some of the heat, to bounce it back out. And permafrost is one that is really scary, and it's one that most people are not tuned into. Permafrost across the globe, particularly in Siberia, places like that, has stored huge amounts of carbon greenhouse elements, compounds. And it's melting, and methane is coming out, and methane is far, far faster as a greenhouse gas, has a much greater impact in the short term than CO2. And that's happening right now. Okay, so much is happening right now that leading scientists and authorities, government authorities across the world have determined that we've got to act very significantly, very fast within the next 10 years, by 2030, to reverse our greenhouse gas production, and we need to start drawing it down, and you'll hear more about that. I put the clock there as 5 minutes to 12 because we're right close to a tipping point. Now, individual choices can help us as we face the reality here. We can, for example, eat less meat. We can make choices in our transport and our energy use and what we purchase. But we've got a much bigger problem than immediate, isolated individual choices will answer. We have a much bigger problem than we can deal with just by trusting people to do the right thing, particularly when some people don't know the right thing, and particularly when some people say we don't need to worry about it because it's not a big thing. So you've got short time, big problem, you go to public policy, and what kind of policy you get? The economic consensus in this country is that we need a bill, a law, that includes the following provisions. Carbon tax, be revenue neutral, not grow government. We need to move away from regulations and let a free market drive the decision making. We need a border carbon adjustment system to protect and award our businesses so that we can't offload our carbon problem and still live in the atmosphere that China and India befoul. And we have to return these revenues that we collect through a carbon tax to households for households to spend as they will. But of course, economics 101, you want something, you want people to use less of something, you make it more expensive. So that's what we're talking about, is recalibrating the economy away from carbon toward more sustainable and safe energy sources. And matter of fact, more than 3,500 economists across the country have endorsed this concept, including several very distinguished people. 3 minutes left. And there's even one in the room. Here's our answer. Here's our solution. It's the H.R. 763, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, now in Congress, bipartisan. And the way it works is money is collected at the point of carbon extraction, mine, port, well. The money's collected in a Treasury Trust Fund. It's paid out in monthly payments to families. Ultimately, this is a gradually rising carbon fee. As we get more and more carbon fee, higher carbon fee, that payback to families goes up. At the same time, this new carbon fee will create, this whole approach will create a tremendous economic pressure for new jobs, new kinds of industry, new kinds of energy production, and it'll give us a healthier environment because a lot of the stuff that goes in the air we won't be having there anymore, and it'll delay or extend the lifetimes of many people. So there's the big picture right there, but what about these guys? Okay. This law, this bill has a border adjustment, which means that if your country doesn't control carbon in much the same way, you're going to pay a real heavy tariff as your goods come into this country. So it makes China less competitive if they don't fix their wagon. Same thing with India. Okay, so 763 will prove the platform for incentive, innovation, and investment. It'll be effective, fast, and fair. Are you going to help? In your folder, there is a constituent letter. We urge you to fill it out, leave it on the table today. We'll collect, we'll deliver to our Congress people and senators, urging them to support this bill. Please take a look at that. You can also call for other speeches and so forth. You may not think that this is the best possible approach. Well, let me tell you something. If this doesn't work, what are you going to do? You better come up with an answer. This is a workable, approved, scholastically, academically approved. The bell's about to ring. Let's bet on this. Write those letters.
I'm Jack West. I'm going to talk to you about Project Drawdown. I don't represent the Drawdown organization. My views are my own, but I'm excited to share this information with you. It gives us a roadmap of solutions to address climate change. So Project Drawdown is a collection of researchers and scientists pulled together by environmentalist and entrepreneur Paul Hawken to identify and model the most viable, substantive, existing solutions we have to reverse global warming. In 2017, they published a book called Drawdown that catalogs the top 100 solutions. 80 of those are ranked according to how much greenhouse gas emissions they can reduce, and 20 are featured as coming attractions that are promising but don't yet have enough track record to reliably model. So the term drawdown, refers to the point in time at which concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions peak in the atmosphere and begin to decline each year. So that's always been our goal, and now it has a name. So the solutions cut across every sector, from energy to transport to land use to materials. It's really an inspiring tapestry of how many ways we have to solve the problem. Let's jump into some of the solutions. Here are the top 20. Just within this cluster, we've got land use, energy, food, lots of solutions here. So solutions related to energy are 5 of the top 20. Let's start there. Drawdown models large-scale solar and small-scale solar as 2 separate solutions. Large solar farms are the number 8 solution. And the costs of solar and battery storage have plunged 85% in the last decade, and solar is now one of the cheapest forms of electricity generation. Rooftop solar is the number 10 solution, and we're going to see a democratization of energy production as prices continue to fall. The electrification of transport is taking off, and this is a solution where it makes a lot of sense for governments and utilities to lead. It presents a terrific opportunity for utilities because building out charging infrastructure could be rate-based, and it's an enormous source of load growth, and vehicle-to-grid applications can create a more flexible, modern grid. Food solutions are 8 of the top 20. What we eat, how it's grown, what we do with the food waste are all within our control. Of 100 solutions, number 3 on the list is reducing food waste. If food waste globally were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter after the US and China. There's an immediate fix here. We can waste less. The next solution, number 4, is adopting a more plant-rich diet. Plant-rich diets generally make people healthier and also save you money, so this solution certainly has co-benefits. Composting that food waste is solution number 60. That's something we can do as individual households and also on a citywide scale if we put the right programs into place. 4 of the top 20 solutions have to do with land use. Afforestation, or planting new forest, is one that we hear a lot about. Drawdown's modeling bears that out as the number 15 solution, and that can be done on degraded agricultural land or former mining sites or just on vacant lots and all sorts of places. Growing bamboo is number 35. Bamboo grows incredibly quickly, and it sequesters 5 times as much CO2 as a like-size stand of trees. And there's hundreds of commercial uses for it. And there's actually a company right here in Alabama called Resource Fiber that is making industrial products out of bamboo, railroad ties, nail laminated timber. They've got the largest bamboo nursery in the country growing in Greene County. They're poised to scale that industry. So Drawdown models both the emissions reductions and the financial impact of each solution. So how much is it going to cost us, and what is the return going to be? Applying a capitalist lens to the climate crisis reveals good news. There's simply much more money to be made in solving the problem than there is in perpetuating it. And anyone who says that we must choose between a strong economy and a clean environment is setting up a false choice. We can absolutely have both. As Ray Anderson, the late chairman of Interface, put it, what is the business case for an economic system that says it's cheaper to destroy the earth than to take care of it? Well, there isn't one. Instead, there are massive investment opportunities in the solutions. So we have all of these 80 solutions, but climate change is a time-limited problem. Everything we don't do today will make it much harder for the next generation to fix. So we need solutions enabling policy, and the one that John talked about is a good one. The Energy Innovation Act will directly accelerate 47 of the 80 ranked solutions. Last year, the Ray Anderson Foundation launched Georgia Drawdown. So they have researchers at Georgia Tech and UGA and Emory assessing the 100 solutions to determine which ones can be implemented in Georgia to bring the Georgia economy carbon neutral and to boost economic development. One of my hopes for this conference is that we begin to talk about an Alabama drawdown plan. Government, utilities, faith and business leaders, and the people that are most impacted by climate change all need to be represented around that table. Tons of these solutions could apply to Alabama. So Paul Hawken writes in Drawdown that we often feel like the climate crisis is something that's happening to us, that we're victims of a fate determined by other people's actions. But we can change the narrative and change the preposition and consider that it may be happening for us. And if we do that, we begin to live in a different world, one where we see climate change not as an apocalyptic inevitability, but as an invitation to build and create and innovate and make a better world. Drawdown is our working draft of how to get there. Thank you.
Jack, thank you very much, Jack. My name is Seth Hammett. I'm here today in my capacity as chairman of the Energy Institute of Alabama. But I can tell you, among this group here today, my primary claim to fame will be that John Northrup and I come from the same hometown, Andalusia. So glad to be here with you all here this morning. The purpose of the Energy Institute of Alabama is to promote reliable, affordable, and clean energy for our future, and to try our best to separate fact from fiction. So I'm going to do my best to deal in facts as I understand them here today concerning this industry. I want to begin by asking the question, where does electricity come from? Well, it comes to us through a three-step process. First, it has to be produced. We call that generation. It has to be transported. It's called transmission. It has to be delivered. That part is called, of course, distribution. Now, what is used to produce electricity? We have coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydro, and solar. And in some parts of the country, in some parts of the world, we have wind. We don't have enough constant wind speed here in Alabama to produce electricity with wind, but we certainly do have access to these others. Well, what has changed in the recent past concerning how electricity is produced here in Alabama? First, I would tell you there's been a major shift from coal to natural gas and to other sources sources to produce electricity. For example, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is located here in Alabama in addition to 7 other states, has converted all of its coal-powered generation units to natural gas or closed them down altogether. The company I work for, called Power South, is converting from coal to natural gas. Now, Alabama Power is converting all but 30% of, or has converted all but 30% of its generation fleet from coal to natural gas. And they're in the process of looking at the remaining 30%. Well, meanwhile, what's going on over in Asia? You saw some maps earlier. Well, China is adding 306 more coal units in their country and building 300 more from Turkey to the Philippines. 300 more all over Asia. And what about India? India is adding 74 more coal-fired power plants. So even though here in the United States we've seen a slight reduction in CO2 emissions, in Asia it's just taken off through the roof. What about solar here in Alabama? Well, we've built so far 5 solar farms and are planning 9 more. So a total of 14 will be in existence when the planned build-out of solar scale farms are in place here in Alabama. Is solar new? Heavens no. I was born out in the country. As a matter of fact, I was born so far out in the country, it was 3 miles from Rose Hill. So I was out there in the country, and we used solar energy. It was called a clothesline, as Jim showed you earlier. And a clothesline worked real good. It was and it used the sun to dry the clothes, and it worked really good when the sun was shining. But what about when it was cloudy? It didn't work. What if it rained? It certainly didn't work. And what about at night? I never saw my mother hang out clothes during the night. So solar has been around for a long time, and it's had a central use for a long time, and it works really well when the sun's shining. Well, why not just use solar? Well, I'm told that during World War II, when the Germans were sinking so many of our ships as they were trying to cross the Atlantic from the United States over to England, that a conference was called by President Roosevelt. And in that conference, he said, what are we going to do about these submarines? And so he was looking for answers, and nobody said anything. He said, well, I've got a solution. Let's boil the Atlantic Ocean. And one of the guys there at the meeting says, how will you propose to do that, Mr. President? He said, well, that's a technical question. I don't know, but that's what I would propose to do. Well, let's talk about solar. First, is solar clean? It certainly is, particularly if you don't count mining to produce those panels, and then landfills when the useful life of those panels has ended. I'll give you one quick example. Power South is building a 700-acre utility scale solar farm down in the south part of Alabama. That farm will produce about 80 megawatts of electricity. It will have 235,000 panels, have a useful life of about 25 years. What happens to those when that's over? When their useful life is ended? They got to go somewhere. So solar is absolutely clean if you don't count the mining that it takes to create them, and if you don't count the waste once their useful life is over. And that doesn't count the batteries. Is solar affordable? It's already been pointed out. The answer is yes, it is. It's very cost competitive now to use solar in the production of electricity. Is solar reliable? The answer is no, unless you perfect a storage system that works. Thus far, the lithium-ion batteries that are used to store electricity has about a useful life of 2 hours. Well, the nighttime lasts longer than that. There's research that says that you can make and promote this up to 4 hours and maybe double that to 8. But you cannot count solar as a reliable source of energy production until and unless you solve the storage problem. Which brings me back to my last point. Now, as an industry, we don't have a position on any particular fuel source, including solar, and we'll do as directed by law and regulation. We just want to provide our customers and members with electricity that's reliable, affordable, and clean. Thank you very much.
All right, well, good morning. We're going to go without the display. Again, I'm Jonathan Belcher with Signature Homes, and what I wanted to share with you this morning is a little bit about the experiment we had with a partnership with Alabama Power in building our nation's first smart home neighborhood. The community was built in the Ross Bridge neighborhood, which Alabama Power reached out to us a few years ago, and they said, we've partnered with, we received a grant from the federal government to have a research and development project where we're looking for a place to build approximately 50 homes. We're looking for something we can do in the next 12 months, something that's not developed yet. And we said, well, we were nearing the end of Ross Bridge. We've got a part of Ross Bridge that has 62 home sites remaining, and it looked to fit all the needs of the power company. So this community, Reynolds Landing, is located right along Ross Bridge Parkway, if you want to go out and visit it. And the objective of this was for Alabama Power to do a couple of things. One, they said, we want to design the specifications for these homes so that they're built as if we are 10, 15 years in the future as to what we see should be the standard in the specifications for the energy use in each home. And secondly, we want to evaluate sources of energy other than coal and hydro, which they chose natural gas, solar, and then battery, and see how each of these perform. As part of the project, as you just heard, you have the generation of power, and you've got the transmission of that power and the distribution of it. Well, one of the keys was that this generation of power was close by. So the solar field, the batteries, and the natural gas or the natural gas generator that was put on site were all within a half a mile of the particular site. And the energy created by each of those could be transferred back to the grid and provide additional energy back to the overall grid, or could be used directly for the community itself. The 62 homes themselves would, based on the HERS rating, which is an energy rating system that is most commonly used, they were designed to use about 60% of what current building codes allow. If you take the average of all the homes that exist today in the U.S., the HERS rating is about 130. Today's building codes, fortunately, we continue to get smarter on how to design the homes. We're building at a HERS rating of 70. So we're already building at homes that are about half the energy use of what all the existing homes are in the U.S. today. This particular project is designed by the power company, was designed to achieve a HERS rating of 45. So even 60% of what today's current code is. And I can tell you, Alabama Power has a lot of really, really bright people because they came in, they said, here's what we'd like to do. They broke down all the different components to what they wanted to use from the standpoint of the heating and air equipment, water heating, the thermal envelope, how they wanted to encapsulate the house, the insulation that would be provided, even down to the smart technology, so that us as humans, who we get into our own habits, we forget to value the energy that's being created each day. So smart technology was also placed so that the house knew when to use energy and when not to use energy. And so they planned every single bit of this, and they went and said, this is how we want you to specify the house. And so the way they used their grant money was, one, to build the power generation, to look for ways that were less expensive on the front end and much more efficient to use because of the proximity and the cost investment that had to take place to do so. And then secondly, look for ways to reduce the energy use in each one of the houses that we're building. So as I mentioned, you have the envelope itself, which required us to do an advanced air sealing. So essentially, we lessened the amount of air that would come in and out of the house. So there are less air changes per hour. Well, when you do that, you've got to create fresh air also, because what does an HVAC system do? It really regulates the humidity in a house. So you have to be very, very careful with it. And with that creates more expense to doing so. And one of the challenges that we saw was that the expense to put the items in the house they're not yet affordable. We still see that our home buyers, they value the shiny things. That when we take our customers through a process, most of our homes are built as a pre-sold home where we let the customer make all the selections, and there's really a lot more emphasis in which kind of granite countertops can I get, or which plumbing fixtures can I get, or can I get this really nice hardwood flooring. No one gets excited about energy when it comes to going to meet with an interior designer. So that's a challenge. So when you ask someone to pay a premium for energy and you say, well, it's going to pay back, you don't really get a lot of enthusiasm about it. So what we learned was we have solutions of how we can reduce the energy use of each home. We've got solutions for how we can better provide that energy generation. What we've got to provide is the education so that the consumers understand the why behind why we want to make those selections, which you're hearing a lot of this morning. You know, the purpose of this event today is to help share those reasons why, and then continue to find ways to provide that energy in a less expensive manner. For example, the top items that we had between the thermal envelope, the heating and air equipment, and then the low voltage, that was about $30,000 per house over what is built per the code today. Well, we had a hard time having consumers wanting to spend that $30,000. So part of this experiment was we included it as the cost of the house. And that was part of the R&D, that was part of the grant money used to underwrite that expense so that customers can then experience it, because the end result was that you have a better experience in living in a home that was served under these specifications. So all in all, I think our opportunity is to create a greater awareness, because we see that consumers do value it. The project's now in its second year. We see that people do value it. They're enjoying a better lifestyle, and they're doing so in a community that draws down far less energy in a much more efficient way. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bambi Ingram with UAB Sustainability. It's great to see so many friends and colleagues in this room. You're probably mostly familiar with UAB. We're the third largest public hospital in the U.S., one of the largest employers in Alabama, and we've got a pretty large footprint, 200 buildings on 100 city blocks, so we've got a really great responsibility there. We recently produced a sustainability strategic plan. It was based on, and that is available online if anybody wants to take a look at it, and I also have a few copies here. It's based on the principles set out by the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education, ASHE, their STARS program. Joyce had asked me to also talk about some of the metrics that are used by other entities, and that would include the GRI for corporations and USGBC's LEED for communities and cities, and also there's an international ISO standard for sustainable cities and communities. This is the 13 areas that our plan covers. Many of them address some of the things that are in the drawdown list. Some of the successes that we've had to date, some of the things, the programs that have really worked well, include our Green Labs program. The Green Labs program started in 2016 with 0 labs, and we now have 120 participating labs. This effort saves enough energy to power about 150 homes per year. The program has also diverted more than 50,000 pounds of waste in a little over a year. We've been adding bike lanes on campus and conducting road diets. We've also got a rooftop solar array that's 50 kilowatts. And we've also are about to open our sustainable home and solar decathlon project. All of these projects started with a new idea and a plan. And then this is what happened when we thought that we could get to that plan really quickly. We all know that any of our goals and objectives meet obstacles and that it's a squiggly line getting there. The problem is that we tell the story like in 2016 that we started Green Labs, and now we have 120 Green Labs, and we're saving all of this energy and diverting all of this waste. According to a Harvard study, most of us feel like at least half or most of our day is spent in the squiggle. Trying to get the original plan and the official story more aligned with actual experience is a potentially very liberating and empowering thing to do. Hard though, but it's the right approach. And I think we all need to talk about and think about the fact that, these things are not a straight line. They are a squiggly line. And so every ounce of effort that we're putting into it gets us somewhere. Perseverance pays off. We have solar on our rec center. We have the solar house that we're about to open, and we have some really fantastic bike lanes and road diets on campus. So at UAB Sustainability, we embrace the squiggle. And a prime example of a long and winding road and embracing the squiggle is our solar decathlon house. We entered the Department of Energy's solar decathlon competition in 2015. It took us 2 years to design and build the house. I see a lot of the partners who worked on that with us here today. Sam Yates is here. He's helping us out with our microgrid. Meryl Stewart's here. Banks Newton. There might be others that I'm just haven't seen yet. UAB engineering faculty, students, sustainability, and community partners and volunteers built the house and tested it on campus. The house was taken apart in 6 pieces, trucked to Denver, and rebuilt. It was toured by 90,000 people in October 2017. We had to take it apart again and then rebuild it on campus. It's a lot of back and forth. The house, when it's open, which will be this spring, is a net positive home. It uses only solar energy. It's on a remote microgrid. That means that it is not tied to the utility at all. So it'll be very available for testing how those systems work. We've got solar, wind, and storage exterior lighting. I don't know if anybody's seen those lights outside the house. If you've been by, everybody's calling them the spinny things. We've got a rainwater collection system that we will use for irrigation on the site and also for toilet flushing. We've got on-site composting and a garden, and then we'll be having student-led tours featuring everyday lessons for sustainable living, so you're welcome to come and visit the solar house on campus. Thanks.
Okay, it was a squiggly line to get here, but look what we got. Just give them another hand. Well, I can say, Lee Haley, who is going to be reading some cards, there is no way we can answer them all, but we will honor them all and see what we can do in the coming month to respond. But, Lee?
So I got a lot of questions. They were still following in. So I did my best sorting them out. The first question that we have from the audience is, has the revenue return model been used successfully in Canada? This is in reference to the Energy Innovation Act. Yes.
Canada has adopted a nationwide fee and dividend program, very much like we're proposing, and that is in play in Congress. They did that after trying out the model in British Columbia. And now I don't know how long the tryout period was, but the National Parliament decided that whatever they had been doing in British Columbia would work nationally, and so just a year ago, it's just a little bit more than a year ago, Canada did pass such a policy.
Okay, our next question.
Well, I can't say definitively that it did, but I presume it did. We can look it up, but the fee and dividend approach for sure is in play.
Our next question from the audience is for Seth Hammett. What is the payback time? I'm sorry. What is the payback time for natural gas power plants, and how long before utilities can afford to switch to newer, more reliable technology, more renewable technologies?
Well, typically a natural gas plant would last about 40 years. And the useful life is built into the depreciation schedule. So to answer your question directly, around 40 years.
For Jonathan Belcher, are you incorporating what you learned in Reynolds Landing to your other newer properties? Or are there other practical applications?
Yes, we've we've taken a lot of what we've learned and then provided that as options in different communities, and we're testing different levels of ways to find better energy use with the new developments that we're creating now.
Next question from the audience. My understanding is that Alabama Power does not reward or encourage the use of solar panels. Is this true? And what can be done about it?
I can answer from a residential standpoint. There's not any incentives or any encouragement from the power company for residential development or new home construction. Does anybody else want to respond on that?
Let me respond to that. There is a fee that's assessed for those that choose to produce their own energy through the use of solar panels on their property. Let me tell you why that's done. You have two costs to produce electricity. I went through this litany earlier. You have the process called generation, transmission, and distribution. There is a cost to have a generation facility, whether that's a solar farm or a natural gas plant or whatever that is. You have the cost of transmission. That is the big lines that you see to get to the get to the substations. And then you have distribution lines. Those are the lines that run to your house. Now that cost has to be paid for whether there's a single kilowatt of electricity produced and sold or not. Someone has to pay for it, just like if you buy an automobile. If you let it sit in your driveway, there's still a fixed cost, and someone has to pay that fixed cost. So the question comes, shall you pay your share of the fixed cost even though you're not taking the product produced, that is the variable cost? If you don't pay it, then who's going to pay it? If you don't pay it, your neighbor does. And we don't think it's fair, I don't personally think it's fair, for someone else to pay for what I use.
Yeah, but I pay $14 a month to have basic service. Why should I pay additional money to have solar panels?
About 2/3 of your costs are in fact fixed. And $14 doesn't even come close to touching that. Now the rate structure that's been set up and approved by the Public Service Commission says you will have Alabama Power Company customers will charge $14 and pay that in fixed cost.
I'm going to interrupt here because there is a proceeding at the Public Service Commission about this very issue, and it is really more complicated than we can fully address at this time. This is what we'll put in what's called the parking lot and get back to. There's some things we just can't address, like climate science and some of this. So we'll put this in the parking lot, but it is a very important issue. Thank you for Seth, and thank you for bringing it up, Jonathan.
Okay, move on to the next question. One of the concerns about solving these problems with an economic lens is that we perhaps make dire ecological mistakes that end up causing more problems down the line. This person gives an example that planting trees is good, but not if all the same type are perhaps not in a native forest species, for example. Can we be certain these solutions are not looked at in a vacuum? And I guess this is a general panel question.
Sure, I'll be happy to talk about that. Yes, every solution could have unintended consequences or repercussions, but we do have to choose from the ones that we have, and we need to make the best choices. Knowing what we know for afforestation, you certainly don't want to plant monocultures unless that makes sense in that particular place. For solutions like renewable energy, you certainly need to take into account things like a supply chain that is not ideal for things like batteries or some of the components. Of course, many can be recycled, but we do need to make the best choices that we can given the solutions we have and try and limit any kind of negative impacts.
Right now, there's nothing in United States law or regulation that says carbon is the problem. Folks, carbon is the problem. We're going to make some wrong decisions technically down the road. But we first have to say, and we have to agree, that carbon is the problem. Let's paint a big red target on it and address it. Let's don't dodge it. Let's don't pretend that it doesn't exist. Let's get busy on it. H.R. 763 is the quick, substantive answer to get started on all the things that we're going to give us the platform to make good decisions and bad. Carbon is the problem.
I'll just ask a few more questions here. I'll use that question to segue into this person asked about bamboo trees being planted. They're very interested in that solution. I also know that you've spoken a little bit about that. Maybe you can.
I'm not an expert, but I am a fan. I was I was reading the Drawdown book late at night and came across bamboo and thought, wow, that one surprised me. I've always thought it's aesthetically pleasing, but I did not realize what potential it has to really sequester carbon and as an economic solution, and started Googling, and lo and behold, there's a company in Alabama that is doing just this. And of course, it's, there are problems. It can be invasive, it can be hard to manage, but if grown sustainably, it can make lots and lots of industrial products that can hold that carbon for decades. So it's a great solution for Alabama because it can be a cash crop, it can be a diversifying crop. And I know that company, Resource Fiber, has a carbon strategy component to it. So I'm happy to talk more about bamboo at length later.
Okay, last question I'll ask is, with the recent announcement, and this one's to John Northrup, by BlackRock, the world's largest investment firm, to move towards recommending companies that have sustainability plans and away from fossil fuel-based sources, what is the EIA, the Energy Innovation Act, doing to recommend Alabama's businesses to being a part of this forward-thinking business plan?
Well, the act will basically formalize the structure to move us away from the problem, the cause. And it's not just BlackRock. Yes, the investor community is becoming aware that there's certain built-in risk now on the course that we're now on. It's a bad bet down the road for an investor to say we can do the present model into infinity. It ain't gonna work. Also, take a look at, and I can't give you the name of this institute, but take a look at the insurance industry. There have been stories lately about how the insurance industry now is building in a factor about carbon, or rather climate, global warming and climate change. There are risks that are growing, and somebody, as Seth said, somebody's got to pay the price on that. So what's the best approach? What's the best approach? What do we do to get away from the risk that we're building layer after layer after layer?
Yes, all the questions I've made.
I am awed by the wisdom in this room and the questions we have gotten. I will say this, there are no silver bullets, right? There's silver buckshot in terms of addressing this issue. And we have heard some of those, and we will put some of these that have come up that are not already on our website, climatesolutionsforall.org. We will try to grow this experience into something that is a nexus for connection about these climate change issues that you most care about. I am awed and grateful for all of you. And thank you for all these questions. We will do the best we can in the future. Can we give our panel another? Before I announce the break, I would like to say something for my dear friend Mary Ann Plant, who is sick in bed today. Her name is really appropriate, Plant, because we talked about trees. And have you seen this row of little fig trees up here? Well, these small fruit trees are intended to add to our theme at our Faith Meets Business dialogue. Once grown, they're going to provide beauty, fruit, and oxygen for the grower, shelter for the birds in your yard, and will exemplify the wonder of nature's creations. The figs are a gift to Faith Meets Business from Dr. N.S. Xavier, one of our sponsors and an avid horticulturist. Dr. Xavier places particular importance on the role of conscience in meeting great challenges such as the climate crisis. There is a short essay by Dr. Xavier on the subject of conscience and climate in your packet. Figs are easy to grow. They're well suited to the central Alabama soil and climate. They're not fussy, they're fast growing, and they like a lot of sun. These figs come from Petals from the Past, a renowned nursery in Chilton County. There are 3 varieties here. There's Brown Turkey, O'Rourke, and Alma. They will grow equally well here and produce equally delicious figs. And I think they're self-fertilized, self-propagating. They'll grow. If you become a fig adopter, and you may, we'll talk more about that later. There will be 30 people at least who go home with fig trees. There's a sheet of directions, and will come with your fig tree, courtesy of Petals from the Past, and they'll be located at the table on your way out. And as part of this gift from Dr. Xavier, would you please stand wherever you are? I know Ann is here. Oh, my goodness. Are the Xaviers here? Oh. And as part of this generous gift, we would like to offer each of our panelists a baby fig tree to adopt and let it sequester carbon and feed you delicious figs. So we're 2 minutes overdue for our break. We'll come back in, 15 minutes, right? And I will want you to know that right now we will be hosting, I think, a TV crew from Channel 13, just very briefly. And I'm glad they want to tell the world what's happening here. Thank you.
Okay, folks. Now we come to the audience participation, the first chapter of audience participation here. You've been assigned to tables. We've tried to make those tables somewhat diverse from location and all sorts of other demographics. And the idea is to speak and listen to one another and talk about solutions or other concerns. Now, our table anchors recognize that we want to stay focused on the subject today, which is climate solutions for the common good. So that's where we urge you to put your focus. Note cards are on the table. There are 2 things that you can do with these note cards right now. Well, actually, you could probably do just about anything you wanted to with them. But what we recommend that you do with them is write down your thoughts about climate solutions in particular. You can write down questions if you want to also. But at the end of the session, we're going to ask the table anchor to submit what we're calling one big thought from the table. And then in the last 15 minutes of the session, we will do our best to read as many of those one big thoughts as come to us. Okay? All of your thoughts on the cards will be recorded and reported to you later. But for the time we have today, we're going to just settle in on what we think is the critical stuff from each table's perspective. So, I'm trying to see if there's anything else I need to say. I don't think there is. So
So one of the things I did want to iterate it doesn't have to be a solution that you thought of. It can be anything that's generated by anything. And the more you write down, the bigger our job will be, but the better our job will be. And if you are somebody at the table that likes to make table notes and you want to be a scribe sort of and want to turn that in, that will help us too. But the big thing is for you to talk to and listen to each other. Remember that we are very interested in the fact that not everybody in our country has been able to benefit from all of the improvements we've made. And so we need to keep in mind the low wealth communities and equity as we go forward.
Okay, folks, we understand your frustration. The good news is that we see this as the beginning of a conversation, not a self-standing conversation. So we're going to go ahead and read a few and just let you know what's going on around the room. One thought: solutions will have to come from all sides: business, government, people, conscience. In order to achieve big changes, must involve youth in the solutions because it's their future.
It may be piling on, but this says education, collaboration, diversity. Involve the people most impacted, including the low-income communities, the children of the future, business, and faith.
Always talk. Always talk when you have the opportunity.
We are teetering on the line between hope and despair. Let me just say something about that. I did something for my church on hope in the time of climate crisis. And pretty much what we really must recognize is that hope is not mushy optimism. Hope is an action verb, something that inspires us to act.
Prevention is cheaper than fixing something. If solution is incremental, it's better than doing nothing at all.
There always needs to be a balance. What are the trade-offs we make in building, shopping, transportation, in combating climate change?
How do we involve the poor in the solution?
And here's another one: include lower income people in the climate solution.
Policy. Need policy changes to improve use of renewables, commercial and residential.
The question is, what are the low-hanging fruits that are economically viable? Is there a local toolkit for the Birmingham community? The solution they suggest, many of these tools already exist in our local community. How can we tap the local knowledge in our communities?
Here's one for a tricolor. Unite and incentivize the revolution.
Deal with tax evasion, tax havens, and collect money.
Transportation is a critical part of the solution. Environmental education must grow plastics. Plastics have to be controlled. Let me mention transportation. The Transit Citizens Advisory Board of Birmingham has a petition out here urging the state legislature to pass public transit funding. Alabama is one of 4 states that has no state investment in mass transit. So please sign that petition. It's out of Tabular.
And note that on our afternoon panel, we do have someone that builds zero-emission buses, and transit is a good thing. Here's a big thought. What is Alabama Power's plan for equitable access to clean energy options?
We all agreed that the most urgent and effective action now is to get out the vote.
So what are more ideas for making existing housing more energy efficient? Start a 501c3 that will help businesses and not-for-profits lower CO2 and their footprint and save money and educate people. It's called Co-Create by this person.
This table sent in 3 thoughts, but I'm going to read number 3. Noted the difference of understanding regarding the usefulness of solar. Would like to come to a common, informed understanding.
You guys are really great. That's just one of the things that's obvious. Importance of connecting with those who think differently, respect, storytelling. What is important to you? I went last night to the StoryCorps One Small Step event. I was one of those people. We need to listen across our boundaries and out of our silos, like this.
Regarding the last note that I read about voting, please know that if you're not a registered voter, there's voter registration out here on the table. So leave here with a voting card. Okay, already read that. 6, mass transit, it says, more ride sharing community in the community. Try to make mass transit a civil rights issue, the right to public transportation.
Here's one on HR 763. How does the money that's generated by producers of fossil fuels get regulated when given back to the consumers, i.e., are there strings attached? No.
Healthy earth and planet before pocketbook. Country before pocketbook.
Here again is, we're gonna spread this word that you're telling us. Education and collaboration and diversity. I think I might have read this one. People most impacted, children of the future, business and faith.
I'm out.
Oh, okay. Yeah, lunch is next. Solving problems are interdisciplinary and vary. They must address poverty, inequality, global empathy, and take action locally and globally.
This one is for the government leaders. Communicate and educate all of them.
Okay, another word for the city, because really we need to start where we are. Plant trees, and that's good for the water because we will, filter pollutants. Promote composting and educate kids on trash. So thank you. Give yourself a big hand.
So now what I'd like to do is to bring up somebody real special. Now, everybody here knows about Greta Thunberg and what she's meant to the world, not just to people in her generation, but to the world. And the good news is that we have young people around the world, every bit as motivated, every bit as loving of us as Greta Thunberg. One of them is here today. Stella Tarrant is a middle schooler at Simmons Middle School. And last fall, some of you probably were downtown at the Lynn Park climate strike. And that wouldn't have happened without Stella. She says, yeah, go ahead. It's a position many of us find ourselves in. If it's going to happen, does it have to be me? And the answer is yes. It all has to be us. So, with no further ado, to introduce Dr. Hayhoe, I'd like to bring up Stella, and let's let her know what we feel about her.
Stella Tarrant, and I initiated the organization of Birmingham's Global Climate Strike in September. I'm involved in many activities at school, including show choir. I have a competition this afternoon, which is the reason for my curly hair today. It doesn't normally look like this. But my passion is fighting to save the environment. For this reason, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Katharine Hayhoe. Dr. Hayhoe is a climate scientist and a professor at Texas Tech University. She has received far too many awards, recognitions, and honors to list right now, but here are a few that stand out to me. She was one of Time's 100 most influential people, Huffington Post's 20 climate champions, Politico 50 list of thinkers, doers, and visionaries, transforming American politics, and Fortune's world's greatest leaders. She also writes and produces the PBS show Global Weirding, Climate Politics and Religion, and has given a TED Talk about what we can do to combat climate change. She believes that the first step to address climate change is to communicate the climate science to the general public so we can understand the importance of taking immediate action. She also believes that everyone should begin discussing climate change as if it is common knowledge and not a controversial topic. When I was organizing the strike in Birmingham, I realized that people don't know very much about the effects of climate change and even less about the science about what is causing it. Most people know the Earth is getting warmer, but they don't know what that means to our planet or what can be done about it. It should be extremely concerning to all of us that there is such a limited understanding of such a big threat to the world today. That's why Dr. Hayhoe's message of importance of communicating the basic facts about climate science and the importance of taking immediate action to avert global crisis is so essential right now. Please join me in welcoming Katharine Hayhoe.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that fantastic introduction. That was so good. We're going to be having a little bit of a dialogue here, as well as me just talking at you. So I want you to go ahead and take out your phone if you don't already have it. By now, the ringer should be off. But if you're the one person who hasn't turned the ringer off, go ahead and do that too. And I want you, on your phone, to go to pollev.com. That's POLLEV.com. It'll ask you to enter something, and you'll need to enter Texas Tech, all one word. And don't worry, you are not signing up for any basketball emails. It's just where I work, that's all. So go to POLLEV.com, enter Texas Tech, all one word, no caps. And if it asks you for your name, you don't have to enter anything, just skip. And I'll ask you the first question, which is an easy question, A, B, or C. How's your lunch? Great, I've had better, and doesn't matter, that's not what I'm here for. This is 100% anonymous. So if you need to express a concern with the sandwich, as a few people do, that's okay, we don't know who you are. All right. It looks like we've got about half the people who don't care what they eat because they're just here to hear about climate change. We've got a third who are very happy with their meal. Oh, more than a third. And then we've got a few who are honest. All right, so now you know how this works. So keep your phone beside you because I'm going to be asking you a few questions throughout. And at the very end, this is how you're going to give me your questions. And you won't only give me your questions, you'll be able to upvote the questions you want me to answer because your time is limited. If you don't have a smartphone, but you have a question you want to ask at the end, I know there is someone at your table who would be delighted to type it in for you. So at the very end, don't be shy about saying, hey, I have a question, and asking them to type it in for you. So I was given this title, and I kind of like it when I'm given a title because I see that as a challenge. I have never given a talk before on our climate imperative. In fact, when I looked at the title, I thought to myself, what is our imperative? So that's what I'm trying to talk through with you today. Often, as science educators, we look, Jim and I, and people like us look at a figure like this that says, Who thinks that global warming is mostly caused by human activities? Anywhere that's blue is less than 50% of people say yes. Anywhere that's orange is more than 50%. And if we zoom in on Alabama, you got Jefferson County right there, 49% of people would say yes. So we often think that our mandate is to educate people on the science. Now, let's be clear. Science is important because it tells us how the world works. We can say, I don't believe in gravity, but if we step off the cliff, like this horse, we are going down. When we look at public opinion data, though, we see that we have a lot bigger problems when it comes to climate change than whether we agree with 200 years of solid science or not. You might say, how can you say we have a bigger problem than that? That's what I'm going to explain. When we ask people, instead, not is climate changing due to human activities, but we ask people, do you think it's happening at all? The whole country is pretty orange. 67% of people would say yes. Then we ask, do you think global warming will affect plants and animals? 69% say yes. In other words, there's 2% who don't think it's happening, but if it is, it will affect plants and animals. This is the danger of statistical sampling. Do you think global warming will harm future generations? Again, it's quite orange. Most of us would say yes. Do you think global warming will harm people in developing or poor countries? The numbers drop slightly. We start to see a little bit of blue come in, but it's still largely orange. Do you think global warming will harm people in the US? There's more blue coming in, but it's still a lot more orange than do you agree with the science? This is the one we looked at just before. But then there's one more question they asked people, and this is the question that really shows our problem. They said, do you think global warming will harm you? And if you want to zoom in here, it's 41% for Jefferson County, and Jefferson County is one of the lightest blue counties in the state, which means the numbers are lower for others. So the first most dangerous myth that we've bought into when it comes to climate change is the idea that there is a distance between us and its impacts. There is a distance in space in that we think it only matters to people who live far away, and there's this distance in time. We think it only matters to future generations. And a big part of this problem is because when we talk or when we think or when we see a movie poster about global warming, what is the number one image that most people in this country would associate with the words global warming? Exactly. A polar bear, usually sitting on a piece of ice looking sad. Or if we see pictures of people, they're of people who live far away from us. The truth is that no matter where we live, here in Alabama or across on the other side of the world in Bangladesh, climate change is already affecting us here and now. We know that we are always vulnerable to natural disasters. Wherever we live, as long as there's been humans on the planet, we have suffered natural disasters, heat waves, floods, hurricanes, droughts. We know that across the United States, we get a lot of these disasters. This is a map of the number of disasters that have caused at least $1 billion of damage for each state since 1980, and Texas, where I live, is number one. But you can see that Alabama is a pretty dark red. So if these are natural events, which they are, then how is climate change affecting us? The one way it's affecting us is by loading the natural weather dice against us. So we always have a chance of rolling a double six. That's a heat wave, a flood, a hurricane, a storm, a drought. That's natural. But as the planet warms, decade by decade by decade, it's like it's sneaking in and taking that 3 and turning the 3 into a 6. And then it's taking the 5 and turning the 5 into a 6. And so when we roll the weather dice, we're starting to see lots of double 6s show up, and we say, what is this? And then we even see a double 7. And we say, where did that come from? What type of double 6s are being affected by climate change? Well, our heat wave season is getting longer. Our heat wave season used to be just over 3 weeks long in the 1960s, and now our heat wave season is almost 10 weeks long. Here in Alabama and the southeast, the biggest changes in temperature we've seen are our nighttime temperatures. Each dot here is a weather station, and as you can see, some weather stations are going up and some are going down, but across the whole southeast, we see on average most of them are going up as indicated by the red dots, a lot more warm nights. How else is climate change loading the dice against us? Well, it's increasing the risk of heavy rainfall. Have you noticed that? Heavy rainfall is a lot more frequent because warmer air has more water vapor in it. So when a storm comes along now, there's a lot more water vapor for that storm to sweep up and dump on us than there was 50 or 100 years ago. And if you zoom in on the southeast, you can see again, some places are seeing less of this and some are seeing more, but on average, there's a lot of increase in heavy rainfall days. Now, Alabama also has a coastline, and we know that sea level is rising too. In fact, the latest headline from earlier this week was there's a new report out that shows that sea level rise is accelerating along U.S. coastlines. What else do we care about if we have a coastline? We care about hurricanes. This is the path of Hurricane Irma, and what it's showing is that that hurricane is about to pass over some very warm water. The redder it is, the warmer that water is. Why does that matter? Because hurricanes get their energy from where? The ocean. And as our oceans have been warming, because over 90% of the extra heat being trapped inside the climate system by the extra blanket we're wrapping around our planet from digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, over 90% of that heat is going into the ocean where it is powering much stronger storms. Now, we don't see hurricanes getting more frequent because the formation of hurricanes is controlled by different factors, some of which are pushed in one direction by temperature and some of which are being pushed in the other. So we don't see an overall change in the number of hurricanes, and scientifically speaking, we don't expect that. But what we do see is that the rainfall is going up. Why? Because there's more water vapor in the atmosphere, and hurricanes are very big storms. So they can sweep up a lot of it and dump it. It's estimated for Hurricane Harvey that hit Houston in 2017. It's estimated that 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey, which in some places was as much as 50 inches, 40% of that rain was due to a warmer atmosphere having more water vapor and a warmer ocean powering a stronger storm. In other words, could Hurricane Harvey have happened 100 years ago? 100% yes. But it would have had less rainfall and been not as strong because they're intensifying faster, more of them are stronger, and they're moving slower, which was also a feature of Hurricane Harvey. They are getting bigger, and of course, sea level is also rising, so storm surge is getting worse. When we look in headlines, we see this. This is from this week, the latest photos of the flooding. From September, the headline said drought. Remember that? We have heat waves that are becoming much more intense, and there was a great article this past summer. I don't know if you saw it. There was a great article this past August that talks specifically about Alabama. If you have your phone out, go ahead and take a picture of this because you want to go read this. It talks all about Alabama, and it tells some very personal stories about what is happening, and how it's affecting people in Alabama. See, it's handy to have your phone out. But it isn't only here. In California, they have wildfires. Are wildfires natural to California? Of course. But back in December 2017, the Thomas Fire broke the record for the largest wildfire to burn the biggest area ever, and then that record was broken in August. 8 months later, by the Ranch Fire, it was smashed by the Camp Fire in November. And what were the headlines this November? Wildfires again. We know that without a changing climate, wildfires would have burned about 11 million acres across the western US since 1980. So that would have happened naturally. With climate change, it's burning more than double. So it's loading the dice against you so much that you're throwing more than double the number of double sixes you would ordinarily. And of course, the most recent headlines have been about where? Australia, where the projections of how the dice would be loaded against us that we scientists made, the projections for the 2050s are happening now. If you look up in Alaska, they just had the hottest summer on record, the worst wildfire season on record, the first time when all the sea ice around all of Alaska actually melted. And in the winter, it was so warm that in the northern part of Alaska, the weather stations thought their observations were mistakes because they'd never recorded anything that high. And I don't know if you just saw the headline, and you probably mentioned this already, Jim. Antarctica just had its warmest day ever recorded. What was it? 65 degrees. It was warmer in Antarctica, the headline said, than in many parts of the US. The headlines back last spring, it's hard to remember back that far, there's so many headlines. The headlines back last spring were about the epic flooding in the Midwest. And if you remember when I showed that map of where heavy precipitation has increased the most, the Midwest is one of the areas where it has increased the most. So climate change is loading the dice against us to such an extent that when the Prime Minister of Dominica, which was one of the Caribbean islands devastated by the hurricane season in 2017, when the Prime Minister of Dominica spoke to the United Nations later that year, he said this. He said, "To deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have lived." We are starting to see public opinion turn on this. This past year, the Yale Program on Climate Communication, which is the program that runs those maps I showed you, this past year they recorded the largest jump ever in the number of people who are concerned about climate change. And when they asked me why, I said there's multiple reasons. One reason are the increasingly dire scientific reports that are coming out from the National Climate Assessment and the IPCC. Another reason is the fact that a lot more people are talking about it thanks to you. Another reason are the amazing kids who are raising their voices and their signs. But one other reason, I said, is the fact that the chickens are coming home to roost. We are starting to see things here. You don't have to go up to Alaska anymore. We are seeing things happen in the places where we live. And so the ability to maintain that psychological distance to climate impacts is evaporating quickly. So now I want to ask you, using your phones, go ahead and get your phones out. This is a little bit harder. You have to give me a word now. All right, any word. If you need to use more than one word, please join the words with a dot or a dash, okay? One word or two words joined by a dot to tell me what climate impacts have you been seeing, have you been witnessing, have you been hearing about or experiencing that you are most concerned about. I know it's hard to pick at this point. But for you personally, who you are, where you live, what you care about, what is most urgent to you? This is a Wordle, so the bigger the word, the more people said that. Isn't that interesting? All right, everybody has something to say. What have we got here? We've got drought and heat. We've got flooding and rain. We've got children, habitat destruction, sea level rise, wildlife, temperature, tornadoes. Impacts on the food chain, yes. Clean water, birds, the beach. Everything. There is no right answer to this question. It's everything. So the first most dangerous myth that we've bought into is what? It's the myth that it doesn't matter to us. The second most dangerous myth that we bought into is the myth that only certain types of people care. Types of people like what? Types of people like the people who set up Earth Day, which is having its 50th anniversary this year. What type of people set up Earth Day? Environmentalists. So I went to Google, which of course gives us our definitions for everything. I went to Google and I said, what is an environmentalist? And Google said this: a person who is concerned with or advocates for the protection of the environment. And it had words. It had conservationist, preservationist, ecologist, green, and nature lover. So some of us resonate with, some of us identify with these words, but some of us don't. And what we often feel like is to care about something like climate change, we have to be one of these types of people. And if we're not this type of person, then it's not on our list of values. So let me ask you, this is your turn now. If you had to define environmentalist in one word, or again, use a dot if you're going to use multiple words, if you had to define what is an environmentalist, if you could put a word below that Google definition, what word would you put? I'm going to tell you my answer too, but not yet. Oh, a realist. I like that one. That's a good one. Okay. So we've got a realist, a human, a steward, a radical, granola, scientist, a good citizen, caring and engaged, a steward, an advocate and an activist, a caretaker, a hippie. Oh yeah, believe me, that's one of the words that often comes up. Excellent. I like this. Good words. Even woke. Somebody who was trying to insult me on Twitter, which happens on a frequent basis if you follow me on social media, someone once called me the doctor of wokeness. And I was like, you don't realize that, but I will take that as a compliment. All right. So here's the interesting thing. Remember, they have these words below the definition, but I noticed there was a little downwards arrow that you could click on. And when I clicked on the downwards arrow, some more words appeared. Eco-activist, eco-nut, eco-freak, and tree hugger. And then I got even more curious. So I Googled, who is an environmentalist? And these are the images that came up. What do we have here on this list? We have one woman who is dead. We have a lot of men who have very large beards. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 out of the 8 have large beards. And most of these people, not all, but most of these people have passed away. So based on this, what is an environmentalist? An environmentalist is a white man who is probably either quite old or dead and has a 50-50 chance of sporting a very large beard. So then, a little despairing, I decided to do a Google image search of environmentalist. And this was the very first picture that came up. So I clicked on it, and it came from grist.org. Grist is a great source of online journalism on climate change and environmental issues. And thank goodness my faith in the internet and humanity was restored, because this is what the article said. It said, environmentalism has been successfully cast as a fringe concern, not a basic universal right of every man, woman, and child, to have a safe and healthy air, water, food, land, sea, and natural places, not to mention economies based on security and sustainability rather than corporate profit and destruction. Yes. Because the truth is, to care about a changing climate, the only thing we have to be is a human living on planet Earth. We are not designed to float around in outer space. Even if we can float around in outer space, we can only do so with the materials that come from Earth. If you're shoved out there into outer space, you would instantly freeze and be dead. Big beard or not. We are people who need a home. We are organisms that live on our planet. Our planet gives us all of the air that we breathe. Just take a breath and think about that next breath. It gives us the water we drink. It gives us the food we eat. It gives us the materials we use to make every safe place that we have. It gives us the beauty of nature that feeds and restores our soul. So my definition of an environmentalist is not what Google gives us. My definition is, I'm happy to say the number one definition on that Wordle, it is a human who lives on planet Earth. That is an environmentalist. So to care about climate change, that's all we have to be, and most of us are humans. I would say all, but sometimes you kind of have your doubts. So that's the second most dangerous myth. The first is that climate change doesn't affect me. The second is I'm not the right type of person to care. What's the third? The third most dangerous myth is this: there aren't any good solutions that I can agree with. I don't know if you're familiar with a senator called Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma, which is near where I live. He is so opposed to the idea that climate is changing that he wrote an entire book called The Global Warming Hoax, more or less. I haven't memorized the exact name of the book, but it's about that. But 8 years ago, he said, do you realize I was actually on your side of the issue when I first chaired the committee and I heard about it? Till when? Till I saw a snowball? Till I opened the Bible? No, until I found out how much it would cost to fix it. A more recent interview with Marco Rubio said, I don't want to destroy the economy over climate change. Look at the irony of the heading under his face. 1 million Florida homes at risk due to climate change. How much will that hurt the economy? We believe that we have to go back to the Stone Ages and give up all technology. We think that all of the benefits that the Industrial Revolution have given us must be given up, people think. I won't be able to drive a car or have electricity or access high-quality medical care or have a fridge. And it's true that if we pulled the plug on all fossil fuels today, if we just literally pulled the plug around the world today, that would be harmful. Because our society is built on fossil fuels, and I am grateful for the benefits that fossil fuels have brought us. I am here talking to you today because of fossil fuels. But long term, there's only one segment of the economy who will not benefit from moving off fossil fuels. And that is, aside from Walmart, who plans to be 50% clean energy by 2025, that is the richest companies in the world. Just cast your eye down this list of the richest companies by revenue. We have petroleum, 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 energy, energy, petroleum, petroleum. And then we have two that have made their money from making things that burn fossil fuels, but they are able to transition, and many of them are starting to do so. So the myth that the impacts are harmful and punitive is true for a very small part of human population, but it is the small fraction that controls most of the power and wealth in the world. Part of the reason why they do so is because the costs of fossil fuel use have been socialized to every human on the planet. And I use that word deliberately because the solutions to climate change are often called socialism. But what is socialism other than distributing the costs around the world to the richest companies in the world, which in the US alone are subsidized to the tune of over $650 billion a year, which exceeds the Pentagon's budget and is 10 times what the US spends on education. The truth is that fossil fuel use is harmful and expensive. Not the solutions, but the actual use. The cheapest way to get coal out of the Appalachians is to cut the top off the mountain. Well, doing so poisons the water of the very people whose livelihood depends on the coal industry. As my friend Marianne Hitt writes here, she says, mountaintop removal coal mining allows toxic heavy metals to leach into local water supplies, increasing what? Cancer, heart disease, birth defects, premature mortality, and more. That's just digging the stuff up. What about burning it? Pollution across the world of air, water, and soil is linked to 1 in 6 deaths. Pollution is the #1 killer around the whole world. Almost all of these deaths occur in low to middle income countries, where up to a quarter of deaths could be related. The majority of them, or the worst affected, are Bangladesh and Somalia. 2/3 of this is air pollution, and I don't know if you remember these headlines from last year. The air in Delhi was turning into a gas chamber. Now, even though people in other countries are more affected, right here in the US, do you know how many people die from air pollution from burning fossil fuels every year? 200,000. How many people have died from coronavirus in the US? 1. How many headlines have we read about coronavirus? 1 million. How many headlines have you read about 200,000 people every year dying from air pollution in the United States? 0. Why not? A couple of reasons. One is, it's been with us for so long, we've gotten callous to it. It's just like, that's just what happens. Number 2, who is it who makes up that 200,000 people? The poorest people in this country. The truth is not only that fossil fuel use is harmful and expensive, the truth is that there are also solutions from across the political spectrum. Like what? Well, did you know that in 2014 was when new electricity installations from renewables officially overtook fossil fuels? Today, 70% of new energy around the world is clean. By 2019, it wasn't just the energy plus storage was cheaper than natural gas for the first time. One of my favorite cartoons, which you've probably seen before, is this one. What if climate change is a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? We know that clean energy is a big part of the solution, and the number 1 and number 11 richest companies in the world, Walmart and Apple, know this. We know that clean energy is revolutionizing places that don't have it. We know that Project Drawdown, and if you're not familiar with Project Drawdown, take a picture of this too, because you definitely want to check it out. Project Drawdown has a fantastic list of solutions that include all kinds of things like smart agriculture solutions with biochar, clean cook stove solutions in developing countries that save lives from air pollution indoors, educating women and girls to give babies longer and healthier lives. And reducing our food waste, because we throw out 40% of the food we produce, which could be used to feed people, and if it were its own country, it would be number 3 after China and the US in terms of heat-trapping gas emissions. There are a whole host of solutions that are good for us. Our basic problem is this: our threat meter is unbalanced. We think the solutions are bad and the impacts are really not urgent. Instead, the opposite is true. The impacts are here today, and the solutions are too. So what is our climate imperative? Often we're told that it is to save the planet. But as a scientist, I have some news for you. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we are gone. If the planet saves itself, it will do so by what? Getting rid of us. And I'm really not joking about that. Our imperative, I decided, is not to save the planet. Where do our motivations come from? They come from who we are. They come from what we value. And for me, the reason why I am a climate scientist and not an astrophysicist, as I was originally planning to be, is because I'm a Christian. And I know that in Book 1, Chapter 1 of the Bible, we are told that we humans were made in God's image for a very specific purpose. And that purpose was to be responsible for every living thing on the face of the earth. What is at risk from climate change? As David Wallace Wells said in his very depressing article and book, The Uninhabitable Earth, he said, what is at risk is us. Our civilization is at risk. The living things on this planet, except for the cockroaches and possums, are at risk. They will still be here. Also the bacteria. We are the ones at risk. So a couple of years ago, I was invited by Steve Armstrong, the chief scientist of Polar Bears International, the man who knows every polar bear in the world by name. And when he sees a polar bear, he leans out the window of the tundra buggy and he chirps at the bear. And the bear comes running across and they go nose to nose and they have a chat. He invited me to go to the Arctic with Polar Bears International to help out with their annual bear count. And I said to him, well, I would like to, but what I'm really passionate about is how climate change affects us. And he said something to me I will never forget. He said, we care about the polar bears because they show us what's happening to us next. If we don't heed their warning, we're doomed to. So I wrote that up in an article, if you're interested in more about my trip and what I learned. I wrote that up in an article for Foreign Policy, you can take a picture here, called People Already Care, just how do you get them to realize it? And they gave the best picture that I'd ever seen. The picture here is of a small piece of ice floating in the ocean, but what is on the ice? Us. We are on the ice. So I believe that our mandate, I believe that our climate imperative is to save the living things on this planet, including us. But the next question is, how? So often we're told that how we can do it is this. Calculate your carbon footprint, consider whether to have children, go vegan, and stop flying. Now, do not get me wrong, these things do reduce our carbon footprint. But if you look at where we fall on the 6 Americas of global warming, if you haven't seen this, it's a really interesting measure of what groups people are in. 31% of us are already alarmed about climate change, which means that we're willing to do something, and we're willing to do something substantial. So let's figure out what individual actions could actually accomplish if we reduce our carbon footprint. Individually, we control about 30 to 40% of national emissions by the choices we make. If 31% of us who are alarmed reduce our carbon footprint to 0, and my carbon footprint isn't 0, my motto is reduce what I can and offset the rest. And that's what I do. That would reduce national emissions by 9 to 12%. If everyone in the US were vegan, that would reduce emissions by 4%. If everyone in the US stopped flying, that would reduce national emissions by 3%. Is this enough to fix climate change? It's not. So I struggle with this because people would ask me what to do, and I would say these things. I replace my light bulbs. I eat locally. I recycle. I've really shaved a lot of meat out of our diet. We eat a lot more plant-based food. I drive a plug-in car. My husband got us solar panels for Christmas last year. I do these things. And by acting, it gives me hope, but it isn't enough. So last year, a year and a half ago, TED came to me. I don't mean Ted, it was actually Dave, but I mean like the TED Talk people. And Dave said, would you like to do a TED Talk? And I said, well, yes, I would, because I've been thinking about what the most important thing we can do about climate change is. I finally figured it out. I would like to do a TED Talk about it. And he's like, we already have a TED Talk on plant-based diets. I'm like, I know, that's not what I want to talk about. And he's like, well, we have light bulbs too, and electric cars. I said, no, that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the single most important thing that any human can do about climate change, and it is talk about it. Because when you go back to these maps, here's the map of people who think it's happening, right? Here's the map of people who think it will harm people in the US. Here's the map of people who agree with the science. Here's the map of whether it affects us personally, pretty dark blue. There was one more darker blue map. You know what that was? Do you ever hear even somebody else talk about it? And you want Jefferson County? I got that. 30%. 30%. So talking about it is so important because follow this logic. If we don't talk about it, why would we care? If we don't care, why would we act? Don't talk about it by hitting people upside the head with all the things they don't know. Bond over shared values. I've had conversations that started with knitting or food. They've started with comments about the place where we live or foreign affairs. Explain how it affects what we already care about, and then find ways that we can work together to act. If you want more, watch the TED Talk, because I'm not going to give you the TED Talk. It already exists. But this goes through this with a lot of examples. So number 1 is talk. Number 2 is join an organization that amplifies your voice. Like what? Like the ones right here. So when you have a conversation with somebody, you can say, hey, would you like to join people who feel the same way about it, who share your values, whether they are faith-based values or place-based values or values based on your love of birds or fishing or for your children. There is a group for everybody. And then as you join that organization, the third most important thing you can do is advocate for action and vote. This is how we change the world, because what are our systems made up of? They are made up of people, individual people. And if you ever doubt that a single person can change the world, let me give you 2 stories to finish with. Story number 1, a man called Glenn, who watched my TED Talk. In May, it came out last December, in May, he attended a talk I gave here, and he said, I just want to let you know I've watched your TED Talk, and so I started to have conversations. He said, I've had a lot of conversations. Would you like to see a list of them? I kept the names. I said, yeah, absolutely. So he reached in his bag and he pulls out a sheaf of papers with 10,000 names on them. He said, we've been having conversations all across my town, and as a result of these conversations that they'd had in just 5 months, our city just voted to declare a climate emergency. One man called Glenn. And I think you all know the other examples. People who aren't even adults and can't vote are taking large pieces of cardboard and painting words on them and standing outside buildings. What difference does that make? All the difference in the world. So never doubt that using our voices can make a difference. What is our climate imperative? I think it is to use everything we have to advocate for solutions, starting with our voice. Because the reason we care about our planet is because it is our home. Thank you. Thank you so much. It encourages me so much to be here with you today. Before I end, we have a few minutes where we're going to take questions, and here's how it goes. I'm not going to be able to answer all of them, but I will be able to answer the ones that make it to the top. So what you do is you type in your whole question. You don't have to have any dots or dashes or anything weird. Just type in your whole question. And even if you don't have a question, you can upvote other people's questions. So I will answer the questions that the most people want answers to, okay? That's how it goes. So enter the question that you want, or look at the other questions people have and comment on whether you like them or not. And if you don't have a smartphone, turn to somebody at your table. I know for a fact that person would be happy to type your question in, okay? All right, while we're still going here, I'm going to answer one question that I often get that I don't see here yet. One of the most common questions I get is, how do I talk to fill in the blank? How do I talk to my parents, my brother, my old college roommate, my neighbor, my boss, my local politician? The answer, again, is by starting with something you agree with that person on, not something you disagree with them on. So check out my TED Talk. And I'm really delighted to say I just finished writing a book, and I handed in the manuscript on Wednesday. Yes. It talks all about how to have these conversations. What do we say? How do we counter objections? How it reaches us personally. And there's a whole chapter talking about something that I saw that's gone to the bottom a little bit. There's a whole chapter talking about why we need a price on carbon. Yes. And part of that is because of the subsidies I talked about, the fact that our fossil fuel use is so highly subsidized that it is not a free market, and we are being artificially induced to continue our dependence on fossil fuels. So how do we change the mentality of infinite economic growth? I like this question because I often get people say, if we can change X first, then we can fix climate change. And my answer to that is no. No. Climate change is so urgent that we have to fix it with the flawed and broken and imperfect system we have now. But by fixing climate change, we are going to address these very concerns. We are going to address issues of tribalism, issues of racism, issues of injustice, issues of poverty and hunger, issues of inequitable distribution of resources, issues of requiring infinite economic growth, which we know by definition is not possible on a finite planet. Climate solutions address these issues, and by fixing climate change, it is our first step along the pathway to a better world. Can I talk more about how my faith supports climate action? I absolutely can, and in fact, what's really interesting, and this is why I love having my computer, is I want to show you. We did a series called Global Weirding, and if you are not already familiar with it, I would encourage you to please absolutely check it out, because it's short videos that address all the common questions that I get. So I made this in conjunction with our local PBS station, and let me just move this over here so you can actually see it. There we go. I made this in conjunction with our local PBS station, and I said, well, I'd like to do a video on what does the Bible say about climate change. And what they found, you can see it right over, it's cut off right here. What they found is that that's the one most people want to watch. What does the Bible say about climate change? So Google Global Weirding, or take a picture of it if you want, and watch that video. And then also what you want to do is you want to read an op-ed that I wrote in the New York Times, there we go, called I'm a Climate Scientist Who Believes in God. And what this does is it explains, oops, just a second here. Here it is. Oh, come on, seriously? There, I think I can't let go of it. I'm a climate scientist who believes in God. It explains how for all of us, no matter who we are, our values determine our reaction or our response to climate change. They could be, again, place-based values. I am from Alabama. They could be preference-based values. I am a birder, I'm a hunter, I'm a fisher. They could be family-based values. I'm a parent. For many of us, though, they are faith-based values, no matter what faith tradition we come from, because every faith tradition has something in it that says, have responsibility over creation and care for those less fortunate than us. So that is where my faith comes in. It is the map that tells me what's the right direction for me to head in. All right, couple last questions. Sorry, it takes a little bit for them to flip on. A couple more questions that you have, and then we'll break, because you need a little break to go to the bathroom and all that stuff before you start again. I know. So, just a second here. What have we got? None of the solutions acknowledge the problem is political. Oh my goodness. It is totally political. In fact, I give entire talks showing how the number one predictor of whether we agree climate is changing, humans are responsible, and the impacts are serious is simply where we fall on the political spectrum. That is it. The problems are political, and that is why we also need political solutions. And so that's why I'm so encouraged by the fact that when we look at bipartisan climate solutions, we have one on the table. It is a price on carbon. People often ask me as a scientist, what's the best solution to climate change? And my answer is anything that cuts carbon, anything that helps rather than harms people, and anything that has bipartisan support, because otherwise it's never going to work. So I'm pretty much behind anything that fits those three. And I'm delighted that we actually have one on the table, because the most important thing to do is cut our carbon as soon as possible. There's no magic threshold. 20, 30, 10 years, 12 years, that's not a magic threshold. We already have some impacts today. Some more are inevitable. But the more we cut and the faster we cut it, the better off we will all be. So, I like the question that's just off the screen. Why has environmentalism been labeled as a radical viewpoint? Doesn't it align with conservative values? It absolutely does. And there's an organization called Conserve America, which used to be called Republicans for Environmental Protection. But too many people were laughing at them, I think, so they changed the name. Conserve America is all about conservative values for conservation, and I love them. But the number one reason why it's been listed as or framed and deliberately framed as a radical viewpoint is explained by one slide that I showed you. Any guesses what slide that is? Similar, yes. The fact that the richest companies in the world have everything to lose from fossil fuel solutions. And they made a calculated decision that it was easier to buy politicians, to buy think tanks, to buy newspaper pages, to buy blogs, to buy some scientists. It was cheaper to do that than it was to change the way they did business. So that is why it is a political issue, and that is why we need political solutions. But that is what you are here to talk about. So please continue the discussion on climate solutions. As I leave using, as one question asked, what carbon offset program? Climate stewards. Please continue that discussion because we need large-scale, system-wide solutions. But how do those happen? They happen with you. The perfect person to care about climate change, the perfect person to act on climate change, the perfect advocate for climate solutions is you, and the social science backs it up. The number one most effective messenger is friends and family. By having a conversation, we begin a positive feedback loop where we increase knowledge and awareness of climate change. So the number one reason, if I could go back to the New York Times and change my answer to that question they asked me about why people are more concerned about climate change, the number one answer, I think, is the fact that we are talking about it. And by talking about it, we are creating that positive feedback loop. So please have those conversations, and hopefully I've given you something to talk about today. Thank you.
Followed you. In fact, I meant to bring my book. I have her book that she wrote. How long ago was that?
10 years.
And you and I had email exchanges about John Christie, who was in the same PhD program. Anyway, here she is in person. I am thrilled. Let's thank her again. And I guess it's time to take a break. John, where's? Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad to meet you in person.
Oh, likewise.
Thank you, everybody. Oh, my God.
Let me remind you what Catherine was talking about that carbon bill. That's the very bill I was talking about, okay? Those constituent letter forms are on your table. I buy her argument that it's all political. It is all political. The science is clear. We've just got to build the grassroots political will to move our congresspeople to action. And there's only really one way to do that. We've got to let them know what we know. We've got to let them know what we feel. We've got to let them know what we expect. It's on the website, citizensclimatelobby.org, and you can track it down. It's findable.
Wow. That's all I can say is wow. So will our next panelists please come up and take their places? There are three people. We've got Ivan Holloway, we've got Reverend Michael Malcolm, and we have got Laszlo Juhász. Yes, that's correct. Oh, I said it right. Anyway, so we are very, very pleased that all of you are putting so much of your energy into this energetic issue. So we're going to get I think Laszlo will go first. Laszlo is from Budapest and came to the United States quite a few years ago because he is an expert in vehicles, transit vehicles, and now he's working at the Vehicle Innovation Center in Anniston, Alabama, and showing us what can be done about transit, which does take carbon emissions out, and also zero emissions transit. Laszlo?
So, good afternoon. My name is Laszlo Juhász. I represent New Flyer of America, which is the largest transit bus manufacturer in North America. We have 3 manufacturing plants in the United States. One is in Anniston and 2 of them in Minnesota. In Anniston, we employ about 630 employees, and we are building 13 buses a week. So, as Joyce mentioned, I am originally from Hungary, and I moved to the US with the business, and we started building city transit buses in Anniston, Alabama in 1989. So New Flyer established a new department in 2017 called Vehicle Innovation Center, and I am the manager of the department. And the main purpose of the department is to promote zero-emission bus technology, and also teaching the essentials of zero-emission bus technology and infrastructure. So we have a training facility over there. We have a very nice classroom, can host about 25, 30 visitors, students. And we have a learning lab where we have almost all of the key components of the zero-emission buses on displays. And also we have a bus bay area where we always keep at least one zero-emission bus. So when we provide our training program, which is our main activity, we can do the classroom activities, we can show all of the components, and we also can show the bus, and also we can ride the bus, and we can do demo rides. So a little bit about the training programs. Our training programs normally 2 days, and we provide these training programs at no charge, and mainly for customers and future customers, but we have all kinds of other visitors. So our customers are transit authorities. They are all over in North America. The biggest ones are in the Northeast, like Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and the other side of the country, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, Seattle. So we invite these customers, and we provide them very comprehensive programs. And after the 2 days, they have a very good idea what it takes to operate zero-emission buses. Unfortunately, what we see, not everybody understands what it takes. So the first things what we do, we explain what they need to operate these buses. So first they need their infrastructure. So the number 1 task is for these transit authorities to contact the power supply company, because if they want to operate 2 zero-emission buses and they want to charge batteries, that's not a big challenge. But these numbers are going up, and they have to make sure that if they put like 50 buses in service, they still can provide the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure. And we established a small group within the company, a 5-member infrastructure group, all of them degreed engineers. And these engineers visit our customers and explain what it takes to establish their infrastructure at the local environment, or in the local environment. So that's the Vehicle Innovation Center's most important task, but we're also responsible for bus demos. So we have 5 zero-emission buses, and we transport these buses all over the country and into Canada as well. And we provide the opportunity to our customers to test the bus and even put the bus in service and try. So, and we have 3 technicians, and the 3 technicians support the bus demos. So how we ended up where we are at today? So before '93, mainly fossil fuel buses provided transit service all over the United States. 1993, electric trolley was put in service. However, smaller numbers had been put in service earlier in the 60s. And 1994, the CNG technology was implemented into the transit bus technology, and we started to build CNG buses as well. 2002, the first diesel electric buses were put in service, and the diesel electric bus put less carbon dioxide out, and of course the fuel mileage is much better. But just like on passenger cars, the hybrid technology is a kind of transition between the fossil fuel and 100% clean energy. So 1993, we delivered one fuel cell bus to San Diego, California, and the first production buses, fuel cell powered production buses, were delivered to Vancouver, British Columbia in 2010, and they served the Winter Olympics. 2014, we deployed the first battery electric buses, and we started zero emission bus production in 2018. The number of the buses were below 100. In 2019, we have delivered about 130 zero emission buses to customers. So when I'm talking about zero emission, most of them battery electric, but some of them fuel cell. So the fuel cell buses mainly deliver to California, but this year we're gonna deliver fuel cell buses to other states as well. And this year, the plan is to build more than 200 zero-emission buses. So we have our portfolio. I don't want to spend too much time on it. So we have low-emission buses, which is the clean diesel, natural gas, and diesel hybrid. And we have the zero-emission product, electric trolley, battery electric, and hydrogen fuel cell. So our buses built, all of the power plant is built on the same frame structure. So we, as a bus manufacturer, we would be able to switch to zero emission next week. However, the transit authority side is much harder because there is a financial impact of the zero emission technology, and also the infrastructure. So the infrastructure is probably today the biggest problem on the transit side, but each transit authority, or quite a few transit authority, is trying to increase their numbers. So the number of electric buses is gonna gradually increasing year after year. And this slide shows only the range limitations of the zero-emission battery electric bus. This is the weight of the batteries actually, but the battery technology is improving very fast year after year. So why battery or zero-emission bus? Of course, the value proportion, green, quiet, sustainable transportation, and the greenhouse gas reduction is the biggest advantage for the zero-emission bus technology. This slide shows our current and future customers throughout the country who are already operating zero-emission technology, or they will buy zero-emission buses in the future. So thank you very much. I think my time is up.
So Reverend Michael Malcolm, he is head of the executive director of Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. He can tell you more about that. It's a wonderful group. And also what's the other group? The People's Justice Council. We are going to be talking about the issues that affect the communities that are usually marginalized and also the rest of us.
10 seconds. I did want to recognize Representative Neil Rafferty, who is with us right over here. Neil, if you'd stand up and say hi. Thank you for being here. I don't know if Crystal Smitherman is still here, but she did make it. Okay, thanks. Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Those who have heard me before would hear me open in this way. Before I begin, let me first honor those who inhabited this land before we got here. We are thankful. We are thankful for them. I'm also thankful for my ancestors who have, whose shoulders I stand on. I stand on the shoulders of greatness. One of my ancestors being that of Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes wrote this. He says, I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. I often, when I speak, I don't use PowerPoints because I don't want you to be distracted on what you're looking at. It's not just that I'm, short, round, and sexy. It's also the fact that communities that look like me are often overlooked and overseen and terribly undervalued. So as I speak, I want you to actually see me. But I don't want you to just see me, because if you see me, you'll see somebody who rather sits in a middle-class section of society at this point due to my education and occupation. But I want you to see the people over in North Birmingham. I want you to see the people in Mobile and Africatown. I want you to see the people in Lowndes County who struggle. Because for us, we don't have the luxury of sitting down in a nice environment and eating good food and looking at each other and smiling and then go back to our homes where there are zero issues or minimal issues that we discuss today. No, for these people and for people that look like me, we suffer now. There are people who suffer from the pollution, who are literally dying from rare forms of cancer due to the pollution from emitting facilities. There are people whose homes are not habitable, but yet they live in these homes when their sewage runs up under their houses. There are people who suffer from sea level rise who are not thought about because they can't buy homes and land, but they're stuck and landlocked in homes that they can ill afford to be in. When you look at me, I need you to see them, because those are the people that are often overlooked. As a matter of fact, if I be real honest with you, I barely heard them addressed today. And as I look out in the room, I barely see them in this room. This is not a shame to them because they did nothing to facilitate their ill living. This is a shame on us as a society, but I must admit that there's a truth that needs to be said here. And the reason I wore my clergy collar and the reason I stand boldly before you as the Reverend Michael Malcolm and make this declaration is because I'm a part of it as well. The church is responsible as well for the demise of community, just as well as corporations are responsible. We've got to put that truth out there. And the reason why is because in history, we're not here by happenstance, but in history there was I call it the Trinity of destruction that got together, and that was big oil, it was manufacturing, and it was the church. got together and designed disinformation that we still have to this day. We moved from being a place of a church and a society that thought about society to the point that the New Deal was constructed. And at that time, manufacturers and oil and those who were in the church got together. And they designed what we have now, which is rugged individualism and enterprise. And we still suffer from that today because of this rugged individualism. You'll no likely get in your car, go to your house, think about what I've said, smile a little bit, oh, that was pleasing, that was good. But yet and still, you'll get to your house and forget about everything I said. And the people that suffer will continue to suffer. However, if we can reconcile that, we've been given solutions today. We've heard about Project Drawdown and the 100 solutions that are given to draw down emissions. We are given solutions, and that we understand we can change political power, we can change the system. We are given these solutions. That's our reconciliation. But here's the hope. The hope is that we aren't depending on you all to do this alone. There is a generation that's coming up behind us in our youth that says that they don't care if you do it or not, we will do it. They have said that we don't care how you feel about it. Right is right and wrong is wrong. They have said that we don't care how you may think or what you may say. You won't stop us from bringing justice and equity to this society. And not only do we have a youth movement that has come up in this time, we also have our faith community that is slowly rising to begin to see past what we have been taught traditionally, and that we go into our churches, spend our hour, maybe 2 hours, and if you were like me and you Pentecostal, then you spent your whole day in church. And then you go home and you forget about everything else around you. No, we are now starting to look out in society and reorient theology back to a place where we care about the people. We care about society as a whole. I've often said, and I'll say again, the planet, as Dr. Catherine Hayhoe has said, the planet will save itself. We're more concerned about the people. We've got to put people back on the planet. And I'll say this as I get ready to go to my seat. Environmental justice is about loving your neighbor. It's about loving your neighbor. Because one of my dear friends is in the room, and he loves me so much. I'm going to say it one more time just for him. Michael Hansen, environmental justice is about loving your neighbor. And so, my brothers and my sisters, as I leave in my last moment, let me also say that the hope is in you. The hope is in that you will hear these words and you will leave out of this place and you will take action, not just to say, oh, look at them, not just to say, oh, they're in a bad way, but you would actually get upset about the conditions that your neighbors live in, because their conditions don't necessarily reflect your condition. And you want it to be so because you know how good you live. So you go back and you raise all kind of hell. Let me say this. Civility is not religious principle. The Bible does not tell us to be civil. The Bible tells us to be righteous. And to be righteous is to be right. And to be right is to stand up for those who don't have a voice, who are often ignored. Those black and brown people, those poor white people who you pass by and you see their neighborhoods and you see all industry in their neighborhoods and you say nothing. No. Start raising some hell. Let me go ahead and give you this, and then I'm gone. Jesus went into the temple, and where's never mind. Jesus went, because I was told that we ain't gonna do Jesus, but I'm gonna do Jesus because I'm a preacher and that's what I do. Jesus went into the temple, saw the discrepancy, saw the disparity, saw the injustice in the temple, and no, he didn't tell everybody just pray about it in hopes that it'll get better. No, he went and he disrupted a system of injustice. He disrupted a system that undermined people, that individualized people, and he declared that my house will be a house of prayer for all people. And I need to tell 2 or 3 people who are in here with me right now, because I'm gone after this. It's time for us to start kicking some folks out of some temples and declaring that my house will be a house of prayer for all people. Because we too sing America.
Well, I tell you what, I'm one of those people that live in my cozy places over the mountain, and I'm so glad to have friends like you. Thank you, because we all need to love our neighbor. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Ivan Holloway, because we had this planning team that met like 4 different months, and so this gentleman came to one of our planning meetings, and as we were leaving, he said, "Now, if there's anything I can do to help you," and gave me his card. So guess what? The reason, but for me, the exciting thing, and I don't know you as well as I want to and will, but Ivan represents the bridge between faith and business, because he is a deacon in the 16th Street Baptist Church, and he is also head of Urban Impact, which is a group that is working to revitalize the Civil Rights District and redo the 4th Avenue shopping area as a freedom walk. And he can tell you more about that. But he does put together the fact that we have to meet some economic realities in the bottom line, but we can be recognize justice as we do it. Thank you, Ivan.
Well, I tell you what, as a deacon, one of the first things they teach you is never go behind the pastor. You always go before, just in case, right? So I tell you what, Joyce, you set me up, so I've got to do something to keep you guys' attention now. So again, my name is Ivan Holloway, and I serve as Executive Director of Urban Impact, and it is truly an exciting venture for me. As some of you may know, the district that I serve, which is the 4th Avenue and Civil Rights District, was a product of Jim Crow. And what created that was the fact that African Americans had to really create an economy that would sustain itself in the Jim Crow era. Fast forward, time passed, and the city evolved and came to be this wonderful and dynamic city as we know it today. But one of the challenges that the community was faced with was disinvestment when we began to desegregate and move other places. Guess what? We took our businesses other places as well. So my job on a daily basis is trying to figure out how we can weave some of that fabric and recreate an economy that represents not only African Americans, but the entire spectrum of the Birmingham community. So that's what I do on a daily basis. But one of the things that I see constantly is we are not engaged in the conversation of climate change. And one of the things that I wanted to be sure, and that's why I joined the organization to lend my 2 cents, was figure out how we can help people understand on a daily basis how they should be engaged and some of the barriers. So, if you'll just bear with me just for a minute. So, I believe that we stand at a critical juncture of community prosperity and community extinction. Many traditional African American communities, if not most, already suffer from challenges living near brownfields, living near coal and steel plants, living near floodplains and other toxic conditions. These environmental conditions disproportionately affect African Americans and poor people of color. It's in these communities that studies have shown already face high rates of asthma, cancer, and other chronic illnesses. You heard the Reverend talk a little bit about that and some of the challenges that we face. I would argue that climate change and its results is especially harmful to these particular communities. When the effects of climate change cause more floods, exacerbate drought conditions, and produce higher winds, those pre-existing toxic elements are spread throughout our communities, creating a soup of unsustainable living. According to Ron Busby, who is the president and CEO of the U.S. Black Chambers, 7 in 10 African Americans live today in a place that does not meet basic air quality standards. Black Americans already visit the hospital more than 3 times our white counterparts. And yes, it is our community where black-owned businesses in urban areas struggle the most to build and grow businesses in a polluted, unlivable, and environmentally friendly. These challenges are intensified, again, by climate change. In 2013, a study by researchers from the University at California, Berkeley, found that blacks are 52% more likely than whites to live in urban heat areas, which soak up heat more than other areas. That threat puts people and businesses in these areas at greater risk of spikes in temperature, the study concluded. One of the biggest challenges with climate change for African Americans, as I see it, is the lack of tangible information and or that of misinformation. One of the things that we believe is that it is so far removed from us until that it's not going to affect us. But guess what? We just learned that those things that seem far away really affect us now. A lot of the impacts on African American businesses is indirect, such as how insurance firms assign disaster risks and increases in prices due to water scarcity, again, somewhere else. But they also include some direct impacts, and they include higher food and service and operating costs. And this is passed on to the consumer as higher prices. They also create opportunities that create shorter operating hours and fewer outlets for our customers to meet demand. So what are a few things that I believe that we can do to help people who are so far removed or think they are so far removed from this? We can simplify our facts about climate change. We can make it non-political, right? Can we do that? We got to do that. So people need to understand in an everyday way what affects them. Use fewer technical terms, right? Some folks are just afraid of technical terms. But if we can just break it down to where folks like me can understand it, guess what? We'll get a long way. Create simple but thorough climate awareness campaigns. We need to be utilizing our schools, our neighborhood associations, our civic leagues, our business leagues, merchants associations, to help people understand that there are small things that they can do and say to make sure that we get involved. On an everyday basis, we need to help people understand that planning their travel routes and how they'll get to and fro is important. How you can park your car and go to more destinations walking than riding. People can do this in a very small way. They just need to be educated on this. And lastly, I'll say, think about our personal and household waste before we buy. Plan what you're going to purchase, and then make sure that you have a way of disposal that is eco-friendly, that is reusable and recyclable. The idea is that we need to get more people who are having these conversations that we already talked about around values, right? And we all have values, but guess what? Those values intersect somewhere. So I told my table number 7 that I wouldn't let them down, so I hope I didn't. So that's my time. Thank you. So if you'd like to learn more about the work that I do and or learn about the work that we're doing in the Civil Rights District, I can be found at urbanimpactbirmingham.org. Thank you so much. Joyce.
I think that if you have questions, Danielle is going to pick them up, and that while she is doing that, I have a few of my own while we gather yours. Laszlo and I talked about the fact of getting people out of their single passenger cars and into transit not only helps the climate, but transport is a real issue. Public transportation in Birmingham, and I'm sure in other places that buy your buses. So could you say a little bit more about the value of transit for low-income communities?
So definitely our transit buses were designed, to provide good transportation opportunities for low-income people. And what we also can say is this, one transit bus, even if it's not a zero-emission bus, can take so many cars out of service because one regular 35 or 40-foot transit bus can transport 70, 80 passengers. An articulated bus, a 60-foot articulated bus, can transport 120, 130 passengers. And I can also say that our buses are very comfortable. We have Wi-Fi on most of the buses, so of course complete climate control. We have buses here in Birmingham, but those are not zero-emission buses yet. So a zero-emission bus, maybe I did not mention that in my presentation, can take 135, 140 tons of greenhouse gases out every year. So even if it's not a zero-emission bus, still can reduce the carbon dioxide emission, but if it's a zero-emission, that's the full benefit. And again, we would be able to switch quickly, but on the transit side, it takes time to gradually develop their infrastructure, and of course, they need a training program because these buses require some different knowledge as well in order to maintain them.
One more just question on, because we had a tour of the Vehicle Innovation Center, and y'all, it was fascinating if you ever get to go. But one other thing about the fuel cell bus, the emissions from that are water?
So the fuel cell buses, I don't know, probably not everybody familiar with fuel cell technology. So fuel cell buses using hydrogen as fuel and oxygen. So the hydrogen is stored in hydrogen tanks on the roof of the bus, and the oxygen is coming from the air. So there is an air compressor which pumps the air into the fuel cell box, and the hydrogen comes from the fuel cell tanks. And the hydrogen and the air with the oxygen mixes inside of the fuel cell box and creates the energy. And the byproduct of the fuel cell box is heat and vapor. And we have a demonstration at the Vehicle Innovation Center in Anniston when the gentleman put a glass underneath the drain tube of the fuel cell, and the fuel cell drain water, and then the gentleman drinks the water. I don't know if I would do that, but yes. So this 100% zero emission. Yeah. So there are of course, plans all over the country which gonna be the most common, and we would be able to talk about all afternoon. That's depend on the customer capabilities and needs.
Great. Good afternoon. I'm Danielle Dunbar, and I'm representing the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of Alabama. So glad to be with all of you. First question, how can we get more churches and businesses to talk about climate change and the need to act now?
Start talking now. All right, just like just as all right, just as I'm doing, do it. Start talking. It's just like Dr. Hayhoe said. I mean, it's the power of the tongue. We've got to really start putting it out there and normalizing these conversations. Most of the time when I engage, particularly black preachers who aren't traditionally used to dealing with this subject, I have to normalize the conversation so they know when they come to me and we start talking scripture, I'm going to try my best to somehow loop it back into environmental justice or social justice. So that's the type of conversation you're going to have with me. At my dinner tables, when I'm with my family, this is something I'm going to talk about. My daughter is thinking about doing environmental law, but she said, Daddy, the way you go about it, I don't know if I want to do that. And it's just that this is my conversation. And that's the way it has to be. We have to embody this. It can't just be words, but it's got to be an embodiment. And when you start doing that, I mean, people run businesses. So you start normalizing that, you'll start normalizing the structures that are involved as well.
I would just say that stewardship, I think helping our churches understand that there is a variety of meanings of stewardship, and one of those meanings is to take care of, and helping churches to understand that its mission is to really take care of God's earth, and God's earth can consist of us as well. So stewardship.
I have just looked at the agenda. Do you know what time it is? It's 5 minutes after where we said we needed to let you talk to each other. Can you ask one more question?
Do that. Great, thank you. All right, one more. What would be the first step to bringing the electric bus technology to Birmingham?
The first step would be to contact us, and we will be here next week. So we have talked to Birmingham, and we have contacts in Birmingham. They visited the Vehicle Innovation Center, the Transit Authority, but that's more of a sales function. Usually the first step is we bring our demo bus to show, and the customer can experience the zero-emission bus operation experience in-house and in city. And we put buses in service in different cities. Right now we have an articulated bus in Alexandria, Virginia. Last week we were in Baltimore, and soon we're gonna go to Shreveport, and then Reno, and so on. So customers who are not familiar with zero-emission bus technology, we have 5 buses, and we can deliver those buses to on-site, and we support the bus operation, and we provide training programs as well.
It reminds me of what Jonathan Belcher said. about the people who want the shiny objects and don't think they want the cushions in the buses perhaps and not necessarily the zero emissions. But let's give our panel a wonderful hand. I wish we had more time for you. You know, a dream is a lure that you throw out, cast out into the future, and then you reel yourself toward. This is a dream that has come true. I thank you all very, very much. Now, I did get some feedback about we did not give you enough time in your table talk because we did not give you your warning, and we just sort of said, okay, pass in your cards. So this time, please talk with each other, and we will give you a warning. What, John, about a 3-minute warning? Okay, okay. And thank you, and this is wonderful. Go for it. And remember to give us the one big thing from your table. I have a big idea. Cities and states should create policy for individuals to be able to have good transportation and envision environmental impact, i.e. recycling. So transportation and recycling. Thank you.
Talk about solutions, how we are connected, and be positive.
Oh. Use our book clubs, civic clubs, and libraries for education and to encourage climate conversations. Yay.
Use houses of worship as venues to encourage climate conversations, create awareness, and come up with concrete actions to take together as a faith community.
Once you're comfortable with your relationship with climate change, find different avenues to connect to others about it. And I would add others who are very different from yourself.
Speak to managers and grocery stores about practices, use of plastic bags, etc. And speak to church leaders about ministry aimed at protecting biosphere.
Community engagement can be done both online and face-to-face, but nothing beats talking to someone in person.
Capture the energy from today and take it back to our communities.
As Dr. Catherine Hayhoe told us, join an organization that can amplify your voice.
Change state policy to fund public transit, treating it as an essential infrastructure like roads.
Our planet is being destroyed in countless different ways and places. It can only be saved likewise.
Getting all voices together and be willing to change our views, our own views.
To get those not like us to the table and give an invitation is not enough. We need to meet them where they are. And related issues are transportation and price of admission. We need economic and racial justice analysis.
Take the message out to our communities. To be righteous is to be right, and what is missing, well, I think what they mean is don't just be preaching to the choir.
Dominion is not equal to domination. An Abrahamic concept of land does not mean we should abuse nature. We are a part of nature, interconnected and dependent on a fragile biosphere. We have to limit our footprint and have empathy for all living creatures, regardless of our beliefs or non-belief.
We need to have buy-in from all stakeholders, and perhaps not all are present today.
Yeah. Well, look, but you packed the room, you maxed us out, so we'll do the best we can, and we'll do even more next time. Most communities have a Walmart somewhere. Why not engage them in being a collection site for more recyclables in addition to plastic bags they now receive?
How do we declare a climate emergency?
Well, we're trying. Oh, this is nice. I'm wiser, and I know more now because of being here. Yeah. Yay, let's hear it.
Poor People's Campaign March, March 2nd, 16th Street Baptist Church.
Oh, yeah. Discover and share best practices worldwide for addressing climate change issues. Composting and trash management is one of them.
Choose a focus, in quotes. Advocate for action, don't give up, and savor the small successes and vote.
Well, we're going to savor this one today, let me tell you. Oh, share. Not. Talk with hope and solutions. We must be educated on the solutions. You're right, because the dismal ain't it awful, it gets a little bit too heavy.
Could churches adopt transit as a human rights issue? Their influence could make a huge difference.
Yeah, this is, I haven't been reading the table numbers, but you guys are great. We need to talk where we live, eat, work, and pray. Take our hope into action.
Motivating to learn about all that's being done. Need to talk about it and find a way to make connections between existing efforts and educate all, especially youth, on what we can do collectively and individually.
Center underrepresented communities, black and brown voices, poor voices in these conversations.
We need to attend city council meetings and ask questions about items in the 2013 comprehensive plan.
Social media is extremely effective in younger generations, but face-to-face contact is still the most efficient way to get your point across. Talk to people. Catherine Hayhoe, thank you. So does Jim McClintock tell us that.
Engage in diversity.
Microtransit as a middle road solution to increasing transit ridership. You know, we thought that Darrell O'Quinn would be here, and there's going to be some interesting thing called VIA, a rideshare program coming up. Oh, all right, already started. Great.
HOV lanes would be simple. More bike lanes are needed, and need to have have conversations and listen more. We need an avenue to further this conversation.
Oh, yes, we do, and we're not going to let it end here. That is for sure. Commit to talking to X number of strangers a week about climate change. More important, to talk to people who are not already on the same side. Yes, but we wanted to start somewhere.
Okay, folks, we're just about there, just about ready to break for the parking lot, but just a few more things and we'll call it a day. First of all, I want you to know that beyond the commitment card, did you talk about that? No? Well, we want you to think about the next steps that you personally might make. This is not to turn in. This is to have a conversation with yourself and think about how to activate yourself on this important issue, okay? Secondly, there will be a report from the conference. It'll go out to the email addresses we have. We hope to pull all your comments together and actually do a little analysis of it and see what common threads and themes there are, so you can look forward to seeing that probably in about a month. It'll take a little while to do the typing. And what we're looking forward to in the future is some kind of continuation of the conversation, but it doesn't necessarily have to be this conversation. As you've heard from multiple sources, you all can have conversations where you are, okay? And lean on people that you know can help, and bring them in and help those conversations get going. We want to encourage everybody, if you haven't already taken a look at the displays, please do. The generosity of our sponsors and our allies help make this possible. And I think that you'll, if you haven't already gained something from those exhibits, you certainly will if you just take a little bit of time. And we have until 4 o'clock when we really have to vacate. And I think, cleanup. There are supposed to be plastic and paper bins back there for recycling. If you can't figure it out, there are containers, garbage cans. So we did try to have a conservation mentality about this, but frankly, it's kind of hard to do something this fast absent a box lunch. But do what you can to recycle, not just today, but as you go forth. So, I would like to say now that we have to close our program today. A lovely group from the Alabama School of Fine Arts, which I think is the best high school in the state of Alabama. But I'm not biased. Anyway, Kathy Spence is here with the Concerto della Donna, and they're going to sing the hymn, Earth Was Given as a Garden. And so as you listen to those beautiful words and the music, let's all be grateful for what we have, and let's be committed to hold on to it. Thanks again, folks. Go and live in peace.
And don't forget to pick up your instructions for your fig trees.